that these differences in usage of Facebook or other platforms can also be quantified and can potentially be corrected for. And so one of the ways in which we could potentially increase the usage of these data sources is to try and understand the bias, how large the bias is in certain contexts, to try and correct for it. And there's very interesting research done by several colleagues on this topic in particular. And the potential of using these data sources is that in certain countries, what we've noticed is that we have a pretty good estimate or a pretty good early indication of trends that are already happening, but that we cannot really see and identify in traditional statistics because these are not yet available. And so one example, and here you can see a comparison with the official statistics of the number of Venezuelan refugees and migrants in Spain between 2014 and 2019, based on official statistics from Eurostat in pink, the National Statistical Office of Spain in yellow, and Facebook, an elaboration of Facebook data for the adult population. And as you can see, the trend is quite similar, even though obviously the absolute numbers are different and have to be interpreted very carefully, which is exactly the potential value of using these data sources, is trying to identify trends as they're happening in sort of nowcasting rather than forecasting what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years. What is already happening? What can we see? What do we need as policymakers to look out for potentially in migration trends in the country? Another example that I just wanted to give you very quickly is the Google Trends Index that we have been sort of playing with a bit lately to anticipate migration trends. So Google Trends Index is this powerful tool because Google is obviously one of the most widely used search engines around the world, with more than 2 billion users around the world. And Google Trends Index gives us basically an index of the popularity of certain search terms compared to all the possible searches that one can make on this online search tool. And so we've looked at the migration-related terms searched on Google in different countries to sort of try and see if we could identify some patterns of migration intentions that would correlate or not with official migration statistics for certain bilateral corridors, country of origin and country of destination. And so we noticed that in some cases, there's a pretty good correlation, or at least these trends are quite similar between the Google searches of migration and asylum related terms and following, so official migration statistics on flows for the following years, such as the example of Syria to Sweden for particularly the period from 2012 to 2018. In other cases, this correlation is simply not there. So I'm just putting the successful example here, but we have to be obviously mindful of the fact that this is just one of the many tools that could potentially be used to anticipate future migration trends or study migration intentions, but that can obviously, there obviously need to be other factors taken into consideration as well.
Arja, sorry, it's Neil. You've got 1 minute.
1 minute, perfect. Thank you very much. So I'll just maybe skip this one, but I just wanted to also mention that new data sources are not only helpful to study migration trends or stocks and flows, but also other topics around migration, such as public sentiment or public opinion around migration. And we've been experimenting as well together with the University of Liverpool on how to use Twitter data to study, so conversations on Twitter, to study public sentiment and also do some topic modeling to understand what topics are related to certain discussions around migration, particularly in light of COVID-19. And so this is just to say that all this work and more that I won't have time to mention today is part of the Big Data for Migration Alliance, which is this initiative that we launched in 2015 with the European Commission Joint Research Center and now also the Governance Lab at New York University to accelerate the responsible and ethical use of new data sources and methodologies for the analysis of migration. and to inform policymaking on migration. We will publish a revised platform, a new platform that you can find at dataformigration.org. We will also publish guidance materials, a guidebook in particular on how to use different data sources to study several topics around migration, but also try to promote the discussion around the governance elements. And so how to facilitate partnerships between public and private sector to use these data sources successfully and ethically, and particularly around the protection of fundamental rights and ethical use of data. So yes, I will leave it at that. And thank you so much, Neil. I'm looking forward to your presentations as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marja. That was really, really very interesting. Without much ado, moving forth to Professor she's the Helen Suzman Chair and Distinguished Professor in the School of Economics and Finance at the University of Witwatersrand. And Dori, you've got about 12 minutes. I'll give you a warning about 1 minute after so.
Thanks, Neil. Good morning, colleagues, and congratulations to the conference organizers. I've heard some excellent presentations over the last few days. So my presentation today is on the translocality of internal migrants in post-apartheid South Africa, where I'll be looking at issues of measures and measurement. And it talks a lot to at least 3 of the presentations that I've heard yesterday by Pedzai, Karen, and Armstrong. So what I mean by the translocality of migrants is their spatial connectedness, or at times the double-rootedness of migrants. And this translocality was enforced during the decades of apartheid, where a range of institutional restrictions prevented the family migrations of Africans or their ability to settle permanently in the so-called white areas of the country. And as a result of these restrictions, families were geographically stretched across originating and destination nodes. Once employment for migrants had ended, for example, because their contract wasn't reattested or because of ill health or retirement, they would return to their households or their communities of origin. In other words, the translocality of migrants was associated with circular or oscillating patterns of individual migration, which is also why this migration was referred to as temporary. With the transition to democracy and the removal of institutional constraints on family migration and permanent urbanization, the expectation was that migration and urbanization patterns would normalize. In other words, that individual migration would be replaced with family migration, and migration would become more permanent. And as a result, the translocality of migrants would diminish. But although available microdata describe a considerable increase in rates of African urbanization since the transition to democracy, which Martin has illustrated, they also describe how many migrants remain double-rooted or how they retain connections, particularly to rural areas in the country. Of course, this raises the question of how we measure the translocality of migrants using microdata, and typically this is identified from the perspective of the household of origin. This requires recognizing that people can be part of a household even if they are not resident in the household for most of the year. So labor migrants specifically are identified in the microdata as non-resident household members who are away from the household for some period of time, typically for at least a month during the year, because they are working or because they are looking for work. So figure 1 describes the share of households that include at least one labor migrant as a non-resident member in South Africa. And the data come from the 1993 PSLSD, the 1999 October household survey, the labor force surveys in the 2000s, and then 4 waves of the NIDS data from 2008 to 2014. And what you can see is that the majority of households that include at least one labor migrant as a non-resident non-resident member are headed by Africans. I'm going to refer to these as African households. And that from 1993 to the mid-2000s, approximately 20% or more of all African households included at least one labor migrant as a non-resident member. With a change in the survey instrument to NIDS, there's a dramatic fall in the share of households that include labor migrants as non-resident members, but the fall is internal to NIDS. It's really pronounced after the global financial crisis and the economic recession in South Africa, which led to very high levels of unemployment. So 2010, there's a precipitous decline in labor migration before labor migration starts to increase in 2012 and again in 2014. When we look at within NIDS at African households specifically according to geographical location, you can see that the majority of households with labor migrants are located in the so-called tribal areas, which are the former Bantustans, often very deep rural areas where there are very few employment opportunities. Labor migration declines from 2008 to 2010. In 2008, almost 1 in 4 African households in tribal areas included at least one labor migrant. Presumably with the economic crisis and increasing unemployment, people no longer migrated to look for work and labor migrants had to return home because of losing work. And then as the economy started to recover, so labor migration rates then start to increase. So the measure of labor migration indicates that there are households that are stretched to include a member who spends much of the year living elsewhere. But I think we need to recognize that it's quite likely that these measures of labor migration underestimate the extent to which urban dwellers or migrants more generally remain connected to another home. And this is because even people who are settled and live permanently in destination areas and who are not identified as a non-resident member of another home may still be attached to this home. The question that arises is what maintains the spatial connectedness of migrants, particularly in the post-apartheid period. And I think we need to recognize that this is not unique to South Africa. The persistence of translocality and circular migration and the absence of institutional enforcement has also been evidenced in other sub-Saharan African countries following independence. And in some cases, studies even document a strengthening of ties between urban migrants and rural households. It's likely that both push and pull factors are important in accounting for this persistence in spatial connectedness and the absence of institutional constraints. Push factors include conditions in the labor market, particularly high levels of unemployment and job insecurity, a lack of access to formal housing, and higher costs of living in urban areas. All these factors discourage family migration and maintain the importance of the rural household as an economic and social safety net in the event of unemployment, ill health, or retirement. Pull factors include strong cultural attachment to the rural home and community, where important rituals continue to be performed and where ancestors are buried, retirement aspirations, which may lead to investments in the rural homestead, and possible access to land. So if we had any doubt about the spatial connectedness of migrants and the flexibility of living arrangements in South Africa in the post-apartheid period, then mobility during the COVID lockdowns last year provides strong evidence that would dispel these doubts. As you will recall, South Africa adopted a hard lockdown, referred to as Alert Level 5, on the 27th of March last year, which then progressed to Alert Level 4 on the 29th of April. Before the implementation of both of these phases, people were given a once-off grace period to move between provinces or district areas before being required to shelter in place. The NIDS CRAM data that were collected during these lockdown periods provide a measure of the extent of mobility that occurred during these 2 grace periods. So in March and in May, it's estimated that between 5 and 6 million adults, it's people aged 18 years or older, moved at least once in March and or in May. That accounts for about 16% of all adults. The majority of adults, about 70%, moved only in March. Just over half of these moves were inter-provincial and about 49% were intra-provincial. And then about 1 million adults moved in both March and in May. If we look at the individual characteristics of movers and non-movers, you can see that movers were significantly less likely to be of working age, significantly less likely to be of pension age, more likely to be of working age. And they were significantly more likely than non-movers to have been employed before the lockdown. When you look at the double movers, those who moved in both March and May, which is shown in the final column of Table 2, you can see that these double movers are distinctive in that they were the most likely of all adults to have been employed in February, and distinctively, they were the most likely to have retained employment in April. They were also significantly more likely to be African, more likely to be male, and significantly more likely to be of working age. Adults who moved only once, and particularly in May, were the most likely to have lost employment after the lockdown. And briefly, if we look at indicators of well-being, you can see that overall, adults who moved during the lockdown periods were significantly more likely to report having experienced hunger in the previous month. But this result is being driven by higher levels of hunger, particularly amongst adults who moved only in May. So these are only descriptive statistics, but they suggest that the double movers, those adults who moved both at the end of March and at the end of April or early May, include labor migrants who retained strong connections with homes elsewhere and who moved home during the hard lockdown to spend the hard lockdown presumably with family. And the single movers, and particularly those who moved in early May, are the most likely to have moved because of changed economic circumstances where moving was a means of economic survival. So then very briefly to conclude, just a few words about measuring mobility and translocality. The NIDS CRAM data are distinctive because they collected information on mobility from the perspective of adults who move, where people were asked, were you living in the same household in March or in May as you had been in February? This is in contrast to household surveys that typically collect information, as I mentioned, from the perspective of the household from which people have migrated. In other words, people are asked, are there other people who are members of the household but who are not resident in the household for much of the year? Now, there are limitations of the NIDS CRAM data because if migrants moved, we do not know the household they moved from. And if migrants moved twice, we do not know if they returned to the same household. And these limitations are really not surprising given that the whole NIDS CRAM interview, which was conducted telephonically, only lasted 20 minutes. But it highlights the importance of the urban demographic surveillance sites that are being introduced in South Africa because they provide an ideal opportunity to capture the translocality of migrants from the perspective of the migrants themselves living in their destination households. And the collection of these data would go a long way to helping us understand further the nature and reasons for translocality and for how living arrangements respond to changes in economic circumstances, or what economists refer to as the endogeneity of household formation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dori. That was quite quick. I didn't even have the opportunity to warn you. Thank you very much. I just want to remind the audience while Kath is setting up, Catherine Hall will be next. I just want to remind the audience to please submit their questions on the link, the Slido link that's available in the comment section of Zoom. I see we've got 2 questions thus far. So yes, and Catherine, are you ready? Or Kath, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Absolutely, take it on.
Okay. All right. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this, and I can feel a kind of a cumulative sense building up. So I'm going to build right on the back of what particularly Martin and Dori have been talking about, and I'd like to, a lot of this is coming out of PhD work that I did some years ago, and I also want to acknowledge Dori, who's not only an expert in these matters, but also a wonderful supervisor. Something we don't know a lot about in this country has been about, and well, certainly until recently, is about the dynamics of internal child migration, or how children are affected by adult migration. So I'm going to be talking about some of the work that was possible with the NIDS panel study to identify patterns of child migration nationally and to explore the links between child and maternal mobility. Sorry, I'm trying to change the slide. Yeah, just to start by giving a nod to some of the sort of the historical dynamics that have already been mentioned, but to provide context to the patterns we see, and particularly in relation to children, this arsenal of racially discriminatory laws that limited movement and residential choices for Black South Africans, to recognize that the system, and here's a picture to remind us of what the old South African map used to look like, in which a system created independent homelands as labor reserves and relegated Black South Africans to the status of foreigners, and where children formed part of the surplus population that was largely confined or forcibly removed to the homelands, along with women and the elderly. And for them, the possibilities for urbanization were progressively eroded through the Group Areas Act, and also structurally through the undersupply of family accommodation in urban areas. So as Dori mentioned, there was some expectation of a rapid reversal when these legal impediments to family migration fell away, but many of the features have persisted, and rural households, we can see, continue to carry a disproportionate burden of childcare in the absence of parents. Within South Africa, the migration literature and the census data has shown various established inter-provincial migration corridors. So, for example, from Limpopo to Gauteng, between KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, and also between the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. Those are, I think, the key ones. And we also find links between children and migrants along these routes. I started out to do research on children and child and maternal migration with the assumption that children are affected by maternal and adult migration, whether or not the children themselves move. And just to diverge from the quantitative data for a moment, as part of the work, I conducted a detailed case study of a family spanning 3 generations of mothers, traversing over 2 years with them the well-trodden migration route, shown here between the former Transkei and a township in Cape Town. I used census data just to make population pyramids of the 2 places out of interest, and the contrast is extremely striking. So the urban home, mainly a place of in-migration, has a large bulge in the middle. It fits with the existing literature, which shows that migration is age selective and it's mainly young adults who move. There are very few old people here. We can see a substantial population of infants and very young children, but then they disappear. So where do they go? The rural village has almost the opposite profile. It's a much smaller population, a very small village, but it's overwhelmingly dominated by children, with a hollowed out prime age adult population and some elderly people. So then that raises the question, where is the parent generation? And also, how would it differ if the census happened at Christmas time, for example? I was also able to just have a look at some of the differences in urbanization rates, head counts, over quite a long period, going right back to work by Charles Simpkins and doing some recalculations from that, and then a range of surveys. So this graph charts the urban share of the adult and the child population over more than half a century. And of course, there are problems that Martin has referred to, definitional problems, the binary definition of urban-rural, and some changes over time, and there's some bumpy bits, but the general trend is fairly clear. So in numeric terms, the homeland policy was extremely effective at keeping the majority of African children out of white South Africa at the time. And the trend towards greater urbanization started somewhere between 1980 and 1993 as more adults moved to town. And although the share of children in urban areas has increased too, child urbanization rates lag still considerably behind those of adults. There's quite a lot that we know about adult migration in the post-apartheid era, and which is significant for children. that there's been a rise in the share of female labour migrants, and that many of those women were also in their prime years for parenting. So that's important. That marriage rates have been declining since the 1960s and have continued to do so, with low rates of union, and women increasingly carrying the dual burden of care and economic support for children, which sometimes means having to make hard choices, including in some of the qualitative work I did, discussions of postponing family migration intentions. That labour migration is a key reason for maternal absence, but also that women with children are less likely to migrate, although this restraint is moderated when there's a substitute caregiver, such as an adult female relative at the home of origin, and that many children do not have co-resident parents. And in fact, South Africa is a global outlier, and I'll show you quickly what was something called the World Family Map that was produced by Child Trends, which just maps out 42 countries. You can see them along the bottom here, and they've been ranked. So the red section is children who have 2 co-resident parents, 1 parent and no parents. And we see South Africa really stands out as an anomaly in relation to the rest of the world, with large quantities of children without parents who are co-resident, who are classified as co-resident of their home. Notably missing from this set of countries, but included in another comparative study, are Lesotho, Namibia, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe. And those also are, of course, historically labour-sending countries and have similar levels of parental absence to those in South Africa. So it's definitely, there's a direct link between labour migration and the absence of parents from children's homes. Of course, within South Africa, national averages always mark substantial inequalities. It's the same with children's family and residence and care arrangements. So if we look at the same sort of measures, both parents, a single parent, and where you have a single parent, it's almost invariably a mother, not a father, and no parents, we can see racial inequalities, income inequalities, pretty much whichever way we cut it, we see the underlying massive inequalities. It is poor African children who are overwhelmingly likely to be without parents. We also see spatial inequalities. And of course, we have to bear in mind the link across provinces. So in the Eastern Cape, children who have missing parents, one might often find those parents in the Western Cape because of these urban rural linkages. The other thing to bear in mind as qualifiers is firstly that although this seems shocking, one is that even when children are not living with biological parents, it doesn't mean that they are without family. Only a quarter of children in South Africa live in what might be described as nuclear families, with 2 parents and their children and no other members. It's not historically a common family form. Extended kinship arrangements are much more common. Nearly 2/3 of children live in households with other relatives with or without their parents. The other important qualifier is that these pictures, any of them, are from the perspective of a child's life, just snapshots in time. We know that households are fluid and their composition changes. One analysis found that nearly half of households had a change in membership within 6 years, over 3 years of the NIDS, 3 waves of the NIDS survey, and that was excluding births and deaths. So a lot of change and churn within households. Some of this change will be due to adult mobility, but some is also about the mobility of children. We know that national migration analyses have tended to focus on the adult population, possibly because of the main focus on the labour market, but have often tended to ignore children. And this gives the impression that children could be assumed to just follow their parents, although there's also been some emerging literature on children left behind. And the rural surveillance sites, which operate as panels, indicate high levels of child mobility between households, and also strong association between child mobility and maternal migration. A limitation of them is that, especially given the rates of cross-provincial migration and urban-rural migration, is that they are unable to follow children or their mothers beyond the site. So I turn to NIDS, which has been mentioned already, the National Income Dynamics Study, which was set up and ran from 2008, and in fact there were 5 waves. I only used 4 of them in my analysis, but it follows individuals over time and place, and it has solutions to many of the challenges for investigating migration. First, it's nationally representative. It's the only national panel study that tracks individuals even if they've moved to different districts or provinces. And this is a distinct advantage over surveillance site panels, which are restricted to the sites in which they operate. Like the census and some other surveys, NIDS asks retrospective questions about migration and the place of previous residents, but because it also follows the panel over space and time, the migration history is built up over the life course of each individual in the panel. Thirdly, although NIDS is a panel of individuals rather than of households, it provides household level information in each wave, including a full household roster. So this allows one to characterize sending and receiving households. It also uses both broad and narrow definitions of the household, and these have been discussed. The narrow definition is similar to what StatSA uses in most of its surveys, that counts as resident members only those who physically reside in the household at least 4 nights a week in the past month and who share food and resources, while the broad definition includes non-resident members who may live elsewhere for most of the time, but are regarded as part of the household and return to stay for at least 15 days a year. The household roster records the same basic information about non-resident household members as it does about resident members. So for an analysis of children and their parents, it was useful because even if a parent is a non-resident member, children can still be linked to them via the person code and the household roster. And you can still obtain basic demographic information, for example, about a non-resident mother through the proxy interview. Finally, NIDS has a detailed questionnaire for children, more detailed than one usually finds, which includes information about absent parents, so that even if the biological parents are not part of the household at all, it's still possible to get some demographic information about them, including their vital status, their age, their marital status, their highest level of education, their occupation. Also, the NIDS questionnaire is administered to the mother or caregiver or of the child or another household member who has knowledge of the child, which is slightly different and possibly more reliable than just relying on a single household informant. It's similar to what is done in the Demographic and Health Survey. I say all this in the present tense with a sense of sadness because NIDS has not run since 2017. And really, I think is a very useful resource for understanding dynamics of migration and what they mean for children, which of course is my interest. What it enabled one to do, and I defined migrants as children who had moved across districts in any one of the panels. If they'd been in migration at any of these stages, they were identified as migrant children, so it was a binary. And the analysis was restricted to African children, specifically because of the legacy, the history of legislation that had particularly affected the family life of Africans. So ending up with a balanced sample, and it had to be restricted to children who were under 15 years in the last wave, because after that they moved to an adult survey instrument, which is slightly different. Just over a third moved place during the panel, 12% moved 2 or 3 times. And then using migration, defining, as I said, as any cross-district move, a bigger move, 14% in the childcare cohort migrated across district boundaries. And if weighted, this represented nearly 1 million children. It confirms at national level the high rates of child mobility found in localized studies. Where did they move? It was possible to look at this not so much down to a provincial level, because then the numbers got very small, but previously economists at Saldra had used 3 waves of the NIDS data to compare the sending and receiving locations of adult migrants who moved across municipal boundaries, and they found that migration streams tend to keep people in similar types. So you can see here the sort of modal direction is urban to urban, rural, former homeland to former homeland, farms, the previous white rural areas of white rural South Africa under apartheid, although those numbers of course are very small, as Martin said. Using 4 waves of NIDS, I repeated this kind of matrix for children and found that while the modal direction is similar, it is less pronounced, and instead there are greater levels of transition from one area type to another. So a much more substantial share of migration from rural to urban areas and vice versa. Why was this, and how did it link with adult migration dynamics? So for this, the next step was to map mothers onto children and look at how the dynamics of migration were connected. Of course, it wasn't possible to match all mothers to children, so all children to their mothers, but it was possible in 81% of cases. In the child migration, it was what became clear was that it is clearly associated with maternal migration. Children are more likely to migrate if their mother already lived somewhere else at baseline, and were much more, over 40 times more likely to migrate than those whose mothers did not, if the mother had migrated. This implies that. Hello?
Sorry, it's Neil speaking. You've got probably less than a minute left.
Okay. So really this is saying that an increase in adult female migration is likely to be accompanied by increased child migration, although children don't necessarily accompany migrant mothers. So that migration is not necessarily at the same time or in the same or to the same place. So then going briefly into a more detailed typology of migration events, they shed more light on the ordering and dynamics of migration for mothers and children. What we found is that when children were sent away from mothers or were left behind or migrated separately from mothers, this happened in slightly more than half of the migration events where either a child or a mother or both migrated. And in these instances, it tended to result in children being separated from their mothers or to retain their separation, living in different places. Whereas when children co-migrated with mother, or whether there was chain migration where children joined the mother or the mother joined the child, they were more likely to end up together. So what we're seeing is a kind of a continuation of the past family fragmentation, but also a move to something that looks like more family co-migration or child and maternal co-migration. Also, interestingly, when children and mothers were separated by migration events, the child was most likely to end up living in a rural area, whereas co-migration that resulted in co-residence ended up with children more likely to live in urban areas. And there's a table of that, which I'll skip through. So in conclusion, the main findings are that migration obviously is not simply an adult phenomenon. It involves children, that mother-child migration events are not necessarily simultaneous or in the same direction. It continues to separate mothers and children. The children living without their mothers or those who are sent away are concentrated mainly in the former homeland areas, and this suggests the endurance of apartheid-era demographic and migration patterns. But nearly half of migration events serve to unite children with their mothers, and when this happens, the direction is mainly towards urban areas. A better understanding of child mobility and also immobility is relevant for population projections, urban planning, education, infrastructure planning, family policy and welfare services, continuity of healthcare, continuity of social grants, and more. So really important, I think, to go more deeply into this. And lastly, just another punt for NIDS. It would be a lost opportunity if it's not resumed or sustained. We've seen already the usefulness of the NIDS CRAM, a smaller survey, but we don't have children in the household roster there. And there are all kinds of things that could only be done with the more detailed NIDS survey. So a national panel survey would be a good idea. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kath. I actually allowed you a few minutes extra whilst I was waiting for the next presenter, Catherine Cross, to link up. Catherine, I don't know if you're online. Thank you very much, Catherine. That was really interesting. It's elicited a number of questions, so we'll deal with those as soon as Catherine has done her presentation. I just want to see, Catherine, are you online? Catherine Cross? I don't see Catherine online yet. maybe what we can do in the meanwhile, whilst we're waiting for Catherine to link up, because I actually phoned her just a minute ago and she was struggling to link up, is just take a few questions and then just that'll give her a few minutes to probably link. That's a bit unorthodox, but I guess that will optimize our time. I see, Dori, you've actually got a number of questions from Gabriel in the comment section. He says, I'm asking 2 questions through the suggested link. The first question is, how do the so-called translocality migrants or distant household residents compare with the translocality absent who decided not to visit their rural origins because of the restrictions that were linked to COVID? I hope you've got that question.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second one is whether you attempted to assess the negative impact of translocality migrants on the spread of COVID-19 to rural areas in 2020 and early 2021 after the window period of restrictions ended under inter-provincial moves. You got us there?
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Gabriel. So I can't answer either of those questions. The NIDS-CRAM data, although the NIDS-CRAM was drawn from the NIDS sample, we can't link people in NIDS in their destination areas or destination households to the non-residents from NIDS. So I don't know in the NIDS-CRAM data who is a translocal migrant, in other words, a migrant who is identified as a non-resident member of a household somewhere else. I don't know who they are. So I can't identify those people who didn't move back home during the lockdown, even if they had another home somewhere else. So I can't answer that question with the data available. And the second question is no, I didn't attempt to assess the negative impact of the move of migrants. I'm not sure how one would do it because the NIDS data don't really allow, the NIDS-CRAM data, it's a small sample, so it's very difficult to just aggregate to more geographically proximate areas. But I think the fact that certain of the provinces were centers of COVID infections, such as the Eastern Cape and Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, and that these are really important destination and sending areas, indicates the significance of the mobility of adults in the spread of COVID-19. That's the best that I can do in response to those questions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dori. I think you did very well. I've got one question, Kath, from Diego. Are you aware of an indicator framework of child migration that is relevant in a local context? And also there was one from Vusi Musi. What do you make of the argument that in the case of the African household, non-biological parent may still be, sorry, where is that now? May still be reported as the biological parents. And I guess how does that influence your information findings?
Okay, thanks. So Diego, I'm not sure about what indicator framework you are referring to. I would like to find out more. There are all kinds of frameworks around. I was also interested and want to go more into an aspiration. There's an aspiration capabilities framework. Is my video on now? Yeah.
Yes, your video is on.
Which is interesting because it also brings up questions of involuntary immobility, which is relevant in the context of migration. But I'll come back to you to talk about the indicator framework you're referring to. Musi's question, I think, is referring to social parenting, which of course is common, and it is a problem in these comparative studies where with an enormous focus on, an exclusive focus on biological parenting. And so, yes, and in no way is this arguing for, sort of family reunification or a nuclear family as an ideal. It's, it's clear that extended families continue to be the norm for many children in South Africa, that multiple people parent, that grandparents often provide men a mothering role in the absence of biological mothers, or even when they're present in households, and that there's a lot of co-parenting. I think that was what you're referring to, Missy.
Okay, thank you very much, Gav. I've got one question for Marzia as well. Marzia, Catherine Meyer asked about online strengths data. She asked how successful are linked surveys to obtain insights into migration trajectories, especially with vulnerable respondents. That's related to online trends data.
Hi, Neil, sorry. Could you please repeat the question? It was cutting a little bit. I couldn't hear it clearly.
I'm sorry, yes.
No problem.
Catherine Kahnemeyer asked about online strength data. How successful are linked surveys to obtain insights into migration trajectories, specifically for vulnerable respondents?
So, if I understand correctly, it's about the use of new data sources for surveying vulnerable populations, or the actual online stream data from mobile phones or social media to study vulnerable populations. Sorry, I'm not quite sure about the.
Yeah, I think that is correct understanding. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Neil.
So for the survey, thank you very much. Yes, sorry for all this misunderstanding.
No, sorry.
So there are quite a few examples. I think when it comes to vulnerable populations, it's primarily not survey related when it comes to data innovation, but mostly to study displacement, particularly in the aftermath of disasters. And there's quite a few examples of that. And actually that was studying displacement in post-disaster displacement was actually one of the first applications of data innovation, of new data sources on migration and mobility. And it was the case of Haiti after the earthquake and the cholera outbreak that followed. Because in these situations, obviously, it's very difficult to collect data on the populations that are displaced, on their needs, assistance needs, etc. And so the potential of using, for instance, mobile phone data to track where people were before and after the disaster based on mobile phone calls made before and after was really helpful to at least estimate where the people were located and then be able to assist them more quickly. And this is actually, it's FlowMinder, also in partnership with other organizations now, has been also applied in other contexts, in particularly in Asia, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, etc. So that is what comes to mind for particularly vulnerable populations. There's also other data sets made available by Facebook called the disaster maps, and they're primarily also about internal displacement, not only related to disasters, but can also be other kinds of displacement, conflict related, etc. But they are at the national level, and I'm aware that they have made those data sets available for to NGOs and to international organizations for purposes of humanitarian assistance. I hope that answers the question.
I think it's an excellent answer. Thank you very much, Marzia. We are still waiting for Catherine Cross. She's really struggling seemingly to get online. Luckily, we've got a few more questions that we can take in the meanwhile, and we do have some time for her to present afterwards. So if you are, I think you've got two more questions. One from Pedzi Zai. Sorry for wrangling that pronunciation. I would like to know how they operationalize the household types in the study. And then also I saw another one from Diego. What do we know apart from census about unaccompanied minors from behind our borders? So both of those to Gav Hall.
I'm sorry, with the second question, Diego, I can't answer. I haven't done work on cross-border migration. I think it's something that needs a lot more work, certainly worth doing. And I missed the first question. It said how to operationalize the household. Something. Sorry, Neil. And you muted. Sorry, Neil, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted. I'd like to know how you operationalized the household types in your study.
The household types?
Yeah, operationalization of household types.
Okay, so, well, I used I didn't have a typology of households. The households were, as they are defined in the National Income Dynamics Study. So that, as I said, there's a broader definition of households, which includes people who would be temporary migrants who have stayed there at least 15 days in the last year. Those, but I was using the child as a unit of analysis as opposed to the household. So and then when it came to, and I didn't get into this, but sort of characterizing the households, where one could see that, for example, when children migrated, they within broadly a poorer group of households, they were generally better off, slightly better off. Mothers were slightly better educated. This was also in line with what has been discovered in other studies. But yeah, children with a unit of analysis, not the household.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kath. And thank you for all the presenters. Unfortunately, Catherine Cross couldn't join us. She's still struggling, and I'm not sure when she will be able to join us. So maybe we should end the session here then. We've got a proposal. Thank you very much, Catherine Hall, Marja Rango. Then, unfortunately, also Catherine Cross, which couldn't make it. She's actually been phoning me and trying to link up. That's not working. So I think with that, we should maybe end the session, have a 15 minutes break, and then start 15 minutes early, if possible, please. At 1:45, that will give a bit more time to Karen's session, if that is all fine for all of you.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Thanks,
Thank you to
Neil.
all the presenters for a really fascinating session. I agree with you. We can take a 15-minute break now. We can start at 10:45. I would just like to bring your attention to the fact that our colleagues from IOM GymDAC are hosting a webinar this afternoon on the developmental impact of migration based on work that they've done in West and North Africa. So I will post the link in the chat box for you to register for that. If you still have the energy to attend a webinar this afternoon, I think it's at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock our time. And hopefully you'll find that interesting as well. So let's meet again in 12 minutes time at 10:45.
To all social service professionals, you have been working throughout the national state of disaster and more, taking care of us and our communities, caring for our children, and assisting children in need of protection and care, caring for the elderly and the most vulnerable, helping to pick up the pieces when South Africans and families are in distress. You have been there for us, standing firm on the front line in the face of this pandemic. And now it's time for the country to care for you, to help keep you and your loved ones safe through vaccination. If you work in the social service sector and are registered with the South African Council for Social Service Professions, you will be preloaded onto the EBDS system. To be vaccinated, you will need to bring your SA identity document or passport, your employee card and practice card, or a receipt for registered practitioners, a confirmation letter on letterhead from your ECD center for ECD practitioners, medical aid cards for those on medical aid, a cell phone number to receive SMSs. please speak to your program manager about where and when your vaccination is scheduled. To check that you are included in the DSD cluster vaccination program, use these contacts.
In these uncertain times, it's hard to create a new normal at home. Financial stress, anxiety, and restrictions mean that children are having to adapt quickly. That is why it is so important that families unite and stay united, now and always. Keep your children educated and engaged. Keep your children healthy and safe. Let no child be or feel abandoned. Let no child be made vulnerable. Let us all protect children during COVID-19 and beyond. In these uncertain times, it's hard to create a new normal at home. Financial stress.
Credence to the title of our conference on migration and urbanization. There have been very slight mention of the term urbanization in various parts of the program up to thus far. So we thought when planning this together that this should really be the session where we bring in and interface urbanization with something like internal migration and have a look at some of the findings and consequences that we see as a result of that. So leading us through this session will be Dr. Karen Ginsberg from Wits University School for Public Health. We'll have a discussant in the shape of Nduduzi Biasi. But to introduce the session, the keynote speaker plus the presentations to follow, let me hand over to Karen. Over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Diego, for the introduction, and morning to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be able to chair this session. And really, as Diego mentioned, we're going to be focusing in on internal migration and urbanization. And this session follows and very closely aligns with the earlier data and methods section this morning. And these domains are obviously connected and overlapping. And thank you to all those speakers for setting the scene for our session to come. So as a number of speakers have noted over the past few days, internal migration is given less focus and attention, although accounting for the majority of moves, both globally and certainly in South Africa. And in this session, we will really focus in on that. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers, both representing local institutions and also collaborations across the globe. And we're very fortunate that they'll be able to shine a light on this. So the program for this morning will begin, as Diego said, with a keynote from Professor Mark Collinson, and then we'll proceed with a set of 5 oral presentations. And we do have a discussant, Dr. Ndu Biasi, who will also end us off and round us off.
Sorry, they chased me out of the boardroom.
Sorry. Okay, I think let's continue. Very happy to introduce Professor Mark Collinson. He is a co-director of the South African Population Research Infrastructure Unit, SAPRIN, and is also a reader at the School of Public Health, Wits University. And I will let you go on, Mark, talking through migration, urbanization, and remittances in South Africa, giving us a comparison of available data sets. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be part of today and, in fact, to be part of this week. So firstly, congrats to the organizers, Stats SA colleagues, DSD colleagues, academic colleagues. Today's been so interesting. And just as Catherine Hall said, it's building. So Martin set us off and we've all been building on it since then. So I hope the building part continues. Certainly the themes raised by all of the earlier speakers will be touched on in my contribution here. Let me start my slideshow. So I'd like to share with you some perspectives on migration, urbanization, and remittances in South Africa. As earlier speakers have mentioned, this goes much better if one has more than one data set to look at. So I'm going to show 4 data sets actually, and we'll see, let's hope that comes out in a coherent way. I will focus on internal migration, even though, as was mentioned yesterday and the day before, especially in the SADC region, cross-border migration is also very much part of urbanization. And so I think some of the dynamics we talk about today will also apply to within region cross-border migration. But for today, we're going to narrow ourselves down to movement within South Africa. It's different from international in the sense that people don't need a new legal status when they arrive. And in that sense, at least one hopes it's somewhat easier. But this too can be a complicated story, as others were building the picture up earlier today. Less dwelling is needed after excellent introductions by others, Martin, Dori, Kath especially. These are the 4 data sets I want to draw from. Just as Martin was describing, the national census is necessary, yet has a broad brushstroke when it comes to migration. I'll show you what those broad brushstrokes look like. Then all of this is drawing from work that's been done and mostly published or nearly there. There's work we did earlier with Agincourt Health and Demographic Surveillance System, linking that in comparison to the census. I'd like to show you that. That also then introduces health and demographic surveillance, which helps for talking about SAPRIN. The third data set is the National Income Dynamics Study. Very nicely, the way that Dori and Kath helped us understand that and its values and strengths, although I won't be using NIDS CRAM data. Then SAPRIN is a relatively new structure for this kind of conference. And I'm looking forward to showing you the results of 3 HDSSs that have been harmonized across the South African Population Research Infrastructure Network. There are 3 rural nodes, which I think will complement and help us in our discussions. From the census, which gives us a purview of 5.1 million people, this particular census 2011 I'm talking about. The census 2011 was a very rigorous and valued census. Much has been done on it. And so I've chosen this one to help us unpack the post-apartheid urbanization and settlement change dynamics. From the Agincourt HDSS, give me a second, I wanted to keep a timer going and I forgot to start it. So there we go. That's right. From the Agincourt HDSS, they have a different migration categorization than in the national census, enabling us to look at what Dori was calling temporary migration, the translocal phenomenon that's so much a legacy of our history in South Africa. We have quite a big population to look at that, 150,000 people at Agincourt. Then we will look at issues of non-resident household membership, again preceded by Dori's explanation of why this is important. I see these as fairly synonymous, by the way. Temporary migration is another way of talking about non-resident household membership. And I think that was the sense that Dori was giving us as well. Around 20,000 people at the baseline of the NIDS. Then SAPRIN, we will use this to look at trends in migration types. Once we have data that's strong enough and fine-grained enough to discriminate permanent from temporary migration, we'll start to see how the trends look and how consistent they are across the 3 rural provinces shown here. And now we're starting to get quite a big sample size, 275,000 people. Now this I'm going to do quite quickly, but it is very necessary that we start in the history to talk about South African urbanization. Here, the issue of urbanization itself and its delays, I think we'll get more insight from colleagues speaking after me. I look forward to hearing Ashira and Philippe's work on urban projections. But also, and Philippe's earlier work taught me this, South African urbanization was very delayed, and that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, at a time when urbanization could have been rolling forward, in fact, as South African was urbanizing, the higher percentage of people living in urban areas, so the rural to urban dynamics were very much changed because of the Bantustan system that Kath Hall was showing us about. The Group Areas Acts with its forced removals, influx control laws that were tied into employment status. Then in the rural areas where those so-called Bantustans were, poll taxes, which had to be responded to in cash, therefore forcing people into cash type labor, stimulated a lot of the labor migration, forced the labor migration that got this whole system underway. And again, as Kath was explaining, women, children, and the elderly structurally remaining behind in the homelands. This quote I like because it comes out of history, but it's still relevant today. And also Francis Wilson and Mampela Rampela are extremely relevant commentators still today. But in their book from 1989, there is one feature of South Africa's industrial history that is unique. Nowhere else in the world has an industrial economy employed for so long such a high proportion of oscillating migrants in its labor force. Okay, that we know. And if we look today, where we're sitting right now, we have the apartheid history and colonial legacy still with us, especially in the forms of its inequalities. The economic inequalities are well known, the Gini efficient, how people's income is so diversified in South Africa. Spatial inequality is an additional one to add, in that things haven't shifted enormously since those apartheid days. So the spatial inequality remains entrenched. Poverty, unemployment at high levels, highest levels around unemployment. Then the health part is important. Some of this started coming up yesterday. HIV, TB, COVID-19 now in the country, non-communicable diseases occurring very rapidly, increasing these epidemics, as Armstrong was showing us yesterday. And the concept of temporary, mostly labor migration being at high levels. Now, this leads us into two narratives. And my main input here today is wanting to have a look at these two narratives. One narrative is a very popular one, rapid metropolitanization. And when I hear people planning, whether in Gauteng or whether in rural areas, there is almost an anxiety around the extent to which the metropolitans are growing. We want to dig into that. But to what extent is this temporary? We have a persistence of temporary migration. We've mentioned that. Data sources struggle with this. And just as Marcia was showing, the triangulation of national census with other less traditional data sets is what I'm going to try and show you now an example of, in order to try and integrate these two things, which are somewhat separate narratives that do need to be integrated for understanding the policy. The kinds of questions here are as follows: around internal migration, who's moving to where, from where. This two-way from where is interesting because streams are important. This was something that Kath mentioned as corridors. Let's talk about those. Urbanization, how are settlement patterns changing? The percentage urban is what leads us into the concept of urbanization. But of course, just as Martin said, the standard dichotomy really doesn't help us. Much nicer to break settlement patterns down into something more than just rural and urban. We'll have a look at some of that. And then remittances. how much is being remitted, what are some of the impacts on rural households. So now I'm going to get into data, and in the sequence that I've been showing you, census methodology, vital all around the world. Now this is required to show a de facto household definition, because there is a danger of inflating your population if somebody is at risk of being counted in two places. And of course, as we see in this country, that risk would be very high here. So it's important people are only counted once at the place where they are staying. You see from this definition, it's the, oh, there's so much jumping up on my screen right now. Let me get rid of some things, okay. Right, so now, in order to tighten the spatial and temporal definition down to this de facto definition, who's residing, they've been here for 4 out of the last 7 nights. That's how it's defined. The migration definition relates to this, because has a person moved into this household in the last 5-year period and then is able to meet this definition that for the 4 out of the last 7 nights they were there. Now with this, in the 2011 census gave us this output, very important one. And today, but this is the age and sex structure of the South African population as given by the census 2011, 5.1 million people, and 7.5% of those were internal migrants, 3.8 million people. Now we get to this, the things in it, because this is getting to the issue of the corridors we were talking about, well-known corridors. These are inter-provincial migration streams. Now, I'm hearing that my internet connection is poor, so what I'm going to do is undo my video, so that, but for that I think I have to, okay, I'll stop my own video because that will mean I have more bandwidth for not breaking. Okay, each of these, so what we have here, remember, it's a 5-year window of who moved into the household that is there at the time of the census. So you are at a place well defined, and so that gives you a location for the census. And now here this is broken by province, Western Cape, Eastern Cape, etc. For those who migrated from another province in, where did you come from? So here our rows are labeled the same provinces. And to make this, but so just for example, I'll show you one of an interesting one. Limpopo, this is a 12%. This is 12% of all interprovincial moves were from Limpopo to Gauteng, and from Gauteng to Limpopo was 2.5 moves there. So this example of how this table gets read, but thankfully this has been summarized also in this report, The Migration Dynamics of South Africa, produced by Stats SA. Right, the Limpopo-Gauteng corridor or stream, we mentioned that already. It's actually the biggest of all in the country in that census. And I showed you those figures, and others all a bit similar. KwaZulu-Natal, strong links, 8.27% of the interprovincial migrations moving from KwaZulu-Natal to Gauteng. Eastern Cape, Northwest, Eastern Cape to Western Cape, this is its own dynamic, and we see the other big metropolitan area coming here. Then the next three, Northwest, Eastern, and Mpumalanga, all links with Gauteng, all fairly similar in terms of the size of the stream, slightly different proportions going in the different directions, right? But key here is to see how much we're getting loads, the combined stream is loading into the more urban place. I want to unpack that some more, because provincial gets us quite far. We think we understand Gauteng and Western Cape being the metropolises, but let's go underneath the level of provincial to unpack it some more. For this, I'll be using Graham Gotts's definition of settlement types of municipalities. Again, this is blunt at a low level in the census. Martin mentioned this too, but still it's very helpful to some extent because it's quite good at showing how the urbanization is working. So we have 5 categories of municipalities: core metros, of which there are 6, and in those 96% of the municipality is urban, right? Example, Johannesburg, Cape Town. Secondary cities, 81% urban within those municipalities, 16 of those types. So you see this hierarchy continues. Major towns are actually more of them, and a higher proportion of the population in secondary cities. As we go down, rural municipalities are important, and there's a lot of them, 77 in the country. And I'm mentioning these because these are where the SAPRIN data will be coming from, those mostly rural municipalities. So we're going to talk a little bit about these migration settlement types. The whole population, that full population pyramid that I showed you, is distributed in core metros, the same categories that I've just shown you. Here's the 5.1 million people, 100% of the South African population that night, of which 36% are in the core metro, a core metro municipality, 14% in a secondary city, etc., etc. Here's where you can see that large towns are more populous than secondary cities, and mostly rural, only 15% of the population. But this doesn't mean, because that's why I was showing you that there are large proportions of rural even in these other categories. Migration, from here is what we showed, that 7.5% of the whole country was registering an internal migration move. Now I just want to show you a couple more of the dynamics. Here's one of them. Now, when it comes, this is showing flows into and out of core metros. Into the core metro from a secondary city, for example, 8% of the moves. Out of the core metro, out of the metro into the secondary city, 5. Why this is relevant is look at the net migration from these different streams. So is the core metro gaining more and in a net migration sense? Well, the biggest one is mostly rural, 6% leaving rural area, 2% coming back, giving us a 4% net migration. I'm setting us up here for showing SAPRIN talking about this rural to metropolitan types of migration. The summary here of what we found so far is very consistent with a rapid metropolitanization project. 7.5, we've seen that. The core metro is the most important destination. Stepwise migration is evident, that people moving to and from the next urban level upwards with relatively clear two-way flows, but the urbanward space always gaining. Now, in order to shift the, sorry, this is the slide. And I can go back to, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. It's easier in a classroom then. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the Agincourt Health and Population Surveillance System, which is located, as you see up here in the northeast of the country. What's interesting about HDSS is they are defined geographically, strengths and weaknesses about this. But it's important that you see that once there is a boundary, everybody within this boundary is located and interviewed. And the until recently, it's been a household proxy reporting on individuals. Now with SAPRIN, we are moving into individual level across over 15 across the whole population. The Agincourt study site from 2017 has 32 villages, 20,000 people. Densely settled rural area and a former Bantustan. And while it's fascinating, I won't go into Mozambican immigrants today. That's another migration story for another day. Now the HDSS, the Health and Demographic Surveillance System, the principles here from a data point of view is that there's a baseline census, and then everybody moving in after that baseline census by day on a daily precision is updated. Births entering in migration, person leaving, and every out migration of a person leaving. When these are managed and kept with some level of precision, you get a dynamic open cohort of individuals, and those are located in families and households located in communities. So this kind of type of setup enables us to get a de jure household definition, including households, including residents and non-resident household members. And this lets us discriminate permanent migration, which has an intention involved, and a temporary migration, who's a non-resident household member as a way for the majority of the time, but remains a member of the origin household. So we've got a de jure definition now and a de facto. Here's the triangulation. This is straightforward, but it's so interesting, and I think this is going to help us in our integration. Within the Agincourt area that I just showed you, when we look at the national census in 2011 and those exact enumerator areas in which the HDSS is doing, the average household size using the weighted census is 4. But the Agincourt in the same population, 5.6. So the difference between the de jure and the de facto, 1.5 household member. Now these are averages. These go from very large to very small. But effectively, because this is averaging, this is saying across that Agincourt population, representative of what it is, there is 1.5 persons per household who are not there at the time of the national census. Within the Agincourt population, let's look at some of these time trends and how the temporary migration looks over time by sex, male and female. These are similar to the numbers that we've been seeing for men going forward from 24 up to 30. Is saying for, in this case, a male in this population, what percentage of them are temporary migrants? And then you see, whoops, male and female. Of those temporary migrants, of which not all are working, but many are, who is remitting cash? This is a relatively high proportion of the male migrants. Female migrants, somewhat less proportion, but of the employed female migrants, it's a higher proportion than the males. What we see in 2017 is something of a crash in the proportion of people remitting. And this, just like Dori was explaining, shows how sensitive remittances and temporary migration is to the economic conditions, those endogenous conditions in which people find today. When it comes to the COVID, the remittances reduce even further. In terms of the quantum of the amounts, again, a wide risk distribution here, summarized into the average cash remitted in the last month. It's not trivial amounts when you compare this with other state, the quantums of state support. Now I'm moving us to National Income Dynamics Study. We've heard that well introduced already. Now, I'm now for the rest of this talk using inputs from a chapter that Mdu and I did together for the Migration and Remittances in South Africa chapter of the Oxford Handbook of the South African Economy. It's coming out in a couple of months. Here we're showing a similar sort of track. We saw some of these types of figures from Dori earlier. This is in the NIDS, the percentage of households with a non-resident household member. And for all households in 2017, 17%, but for African rural households, especially 24%. See, it's not so dissimilar from what we were getting in Agincourt. We're not so far getting a mixed message between the Agincourt and the NIDS. We're getting quite a consistent message. 2010 is difficult here. Dori was showing that too, and whether this is somehow slightly related to the method of starting up this NIDS survey, or whether this is in comparison also with the the economic situation that reduced this. We have seen that temporary migration is sensitive, but other than this 2010 point, this is very similar to what we've just saw, but by adding age and sex on it. Here, I want to show that in the NIDS data, and to the 2 points here, so I'm not talking a lot about those. These two solid lines, this is the male line from 2014, this is the female line, that the mode seems to be getting higher for both males and females of, these are the non-residential household members as a proportion of residential household members. And also the mode is shifting slightly younger over time, over the course of these changes. What's interesting here, and I've included this is Mdu Biasi's work, because we want to know a little more about the remittances that I can show you in this brief overview, this complex looking table is showing us two things. If we look at the rural households, this is African rural households in the NIDS survey, and this is quantiles of expenditure, actually of consumption. So these are consumption. So these are the poorest households, and a fifth of the distribution is in each row. Now, the question here that Mdu is modeling for us with NIDS data, what is those who have remittances, what is the likelihood that food is being bought with the remittances, broken down by these quintiles? And you see that the poorer households, it's a relationship showing that the poorest households much more likely to be spending remittances on food. Better off households, it's exactly flipped, and less likely to be spending, better off households more likely to be spending money on human capital, and poorer households less from the remittances. So just also a sense of the lack of homogeneity in rural areas, realizing just how much that national inequality also plays out in rural areas too. Right, now I'm going to use my last few minutes to show SAPRIN data contributing to these debates, and I'm hoping taking some of them forward, and I'm looking for some kinds of measures of how we bring in these narratives in a more meaningful way for policy, because we're dependent on the census data, but we're not getting enough of the circularity in the census data. So we do need something more structured and more routine. SAPRIN, which has been developed by the Department of Science and Innovation, has been in a program node. Here's Agincourt that we've been looking at. And then Africa Health Research Institute in Northern KZN. This is also very well known rural HDSS, and also the Demamo one at the University of Limpopo. These three have been existing between them an average of 20 years each, Agincourt the longest. And so I'll now show you data from these three sites that have now been harmonized on the topics that we've been discussing. But the Gauteng one is now in place. I'm not sure if David is on the call, but the Gauteng node is now collecting data and will soon be contributing to this. It'll have turned blue once it's gone through its first baseline. The Cape Town one is set up and budgeted for, and the plan is in place. And so the urban ones, as was discussed earlier, will be very helpful to add to this kind of thing going forward. These nodes are now, once they're SAPRIN nodes, at least 100,000 individuals. And when all these 7 are in place, we'll have around 1% of the population. Now I have 3 slides to show you of 4 graphs each. So I want to explain them to you. The Agincourt Mpumalanga slide, the aim of this slide is to show that we can use this, we can combine all 3 of these rural nodes to give us the SAPRIN population, which is the upper left. This is the age and sex profile of a particular migration type. I chose here temporary out-migration. I'm showing you temporary out-migration, age, sex profile for each of these 3 nodes and the combination, right? Here's Agincourt. Males, a very big mode here, and around 25. Women also in temporary out-migration, about half of the mode, but look at the shape. And children there, but not highly there. The Dimamo node from Limpopo, much less population at this point. It's grown since, but that's why there's wider conference intervals and much more up and down here. But the essential pattern is very similar. And again in Ari too, the female migration is closer to the male migration pattern. In Ari, the mode is about the same age, the shape is about the same. And when we look at the whole combined Sapran population, which is now quite big, we feel quite confident that we're representing something that is, we're not just mashing things together that don't belong together. So now I'm going to go quickly. In fact, I'm going to leave that one off because we're running out of time. Because of, this is now showing what we're really interested in. This is time. Along the axis now, along the axis is calendar time from 2000 to 2017. This is for the first time we're showing flow rates, not stock measures. We're showing migration as an event. It's got daily precision at each day in all these years. How many people did this type of move as a hazard of the whole population at risk? A very precise statistical measure across a big population. That's why you're seeing tight confidence intervals. Now, definitive or permanent migration decline, using less. This is the kind of migration where people are getting married, moving together, or moving apart. The definitive in migration is quite a close parallel to this because people are moving in and moving out in this permanent way. So it's not a surprise that the angle of the decline is quite the same over this period. When it comes to
Mark,
temporary...
just a slight interruption. Can we wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes, please?
Yes, exactly. Will do, Karen. This is my concluding slide, and then I'll end. Now, these are 4 different types of migrations. The permanent type here, which is declining over time in these rural areas. The temporary out migration, which is to places that are mostly metropolitan, as we saw in the earlier data, yet nevertheless, right up to 2017, not much change, a little rise here, and then fairly steady measures of temporary out migration rates. So this is people leaving one of those rural households to become a temporary migration. Once they become a temporary migrant, we stop counting them. We let them stay in their distant place until they move back into the rural population. We're keeping track of them, but we've discriminated from the permanent to the temporary here. So this is a very good measure of temporary out migration rates and temporary in migration rates. The trend in that, the trend of temporary in is very interestingly flat, which means people are returning back from wherever they were working back into these rural populations consistently across these nodes, and that this is quite a high level of a migration rate. So we want to report a declining in definitive migration, whereas a sustaining of temporary migration. In conclusion, Southern African population characteristics require a triangulation of data sets. This was mentioned earlier. It was reminding me of what the minister said on Monday. We need, to a large extent, African solutions to African dilemmas, and the extent of labor migration is an African dilemma. We can't expect standard methods to help us unpack our problem here. The national census explains metropolitanization very well. The NIDS shows us persistent non-residential household membership. The Agincourt, persistent temporary migration. Remittances, small but meaningful. And thanks to Mdu's work using NIDS, we can see how poorer households investing especially on food expenditure better off on human capital. And that the remittances are vulnerable to economic conditions. These are in no way fixed, so we need to protect them. Sapran is a newly accessible data resource website, and the actual scripts to do the what I've just shown you are also accessible. And this is systematic measurement of non-residents to complement what we've seen in the national census. Now, as a scholar of this for more than a decade, I want to say, in combining these narratives, I think it's very important to combine them. We must not look at metropolitanization on its own. Otherwise, we are misled in how we're planning. And we need to see the temporary nature of people moving into the cities. But in order to understand this more, I think we need more routine and accurate data on the de jure household size minus the de facto household size to get us this margin of what percentage of a household isn't there. When we know that, we're going to be able to plan better. For example, immunization programs. If people are back in their rural homes, then our data is quite out. If you imagine every household has 1.5 more people than there were originally in the plan that the government is using, yet people have mostly gone home, as we've seen is a strong reaction. Dory and Karen have shown us that. Then, of course, there'll be inadequate immunization resources in those rural areas because at the time of the census, people were counted in the metropolitan area. I'll stop there, Karen. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a really rich and insightful presentation. Drew very well and connected in with what we've heard earlier today and really highlighted the rich data sets that we have available to us to begin to unpack some of these settlement dynamics. We're going to move on now to the next set of 5 oral presentations. I will just remind you all to please post your questions in the Slido chat on the Slido platform, and we'll address all questions at the end of the session. Can you also please indicate in your questions the speaker to whom you're directing the question? Then to speakers of this next session, we're going to be sticking to time, so you'll have a maximum of 12 minutes. I will be nudging you along, and thank you for respecting the time limits. So to begin, we are going to have an input from Sadsan Harawa. He's from the MRC Wits Agincourt unit at Wits University and will be presenting on behalf of himself and co-author Professor Michael White from Brown University on internal migration and development. So over to you, Sadsan.
Thank you, Karen. I hope everyone can see my slides.
Yes.
All good. Thanks, Sadsan.
Thank you. So my name is Sadsan Harawa. I am presenting on behalf of the Migrant Health Force Upstudy team. And as Karen has said, the presentation was prepared by my principal investigator for the project, Professor Mike White, who is based at Brown University. So my presentation is basically a continuation of what we've been discussing. Karen made a presentation on the same topic yesterday, and again, Armstrong touched on the same, and again, today again, Professor Mark Collinson also touched on the same point about internal migration and urbanization. So the contribution the presentation is going to make is in relation to internal migration in South Africa, particularly Northeast South Africa in Bushbuck region, Mpumalanga. So the topic of presentation is internal migration and development, recent empirical insights from South Africa. So this is the motivation for the presentation. Migration and urbanization is generally reshaping contemporary societies, which is involves providing opportunities such as breaking intergenerational traps of poverty. Again, it raises challenges at the same time on economic health of the people and again, socially. Experience of internal migration may be very heterogeneous as per the observations such as for migrants themselves, for the communities they join when they migrate, and those they leave behind. This means like families are left behind and their partners as well. Even though attention has been much on international migration at global level, currently the scale of internal migration, that is people residing out of the district of birth, is 3 times higher than the size of international migration. And this has raised some concerns about health outcomes, and again, some inequalities in terms of like distribution of resources, and again, efficiency in development of policies. So as a way of responding to some of these gaps highlighted earlier on, the Migrant Health Follow-up Study team initiated a study called Migrant Health Follow-up Study, which is a follow-up to a study that was conducted around 2012 and 2013. So the project basically aims at improving an understanding of how migration and urbanization is impacting on well-being and the trade-offs between, such as salutary increases in economic circumstances, health and socio-economic risks, such as that accompany that kind of mobility, and the impact on migrant and others in the household. Again, it also improves an understanding of population redistribution, especially temporal and oscillatory movements. Also, it informs companion health investigators on areas that need to be investigated even further. And again, how internal migration and urbanization may compromise or improve care and treatment, especially for those who have migrated. Sometimes it does compromise treatment or access to health services. So the Migrant Health Follow-up Study is a panel cohort study, longitudinal in nature, that is following up individuals. This was mentioned before, I think in a previous presentation, so I won't go much into detail to this. I think Karen yesterday talked about the different waves of the project, like wave 1, wave 2, and wave 3, and then wave 4 to 5, where wave 1, we did like a face-to-face encounter, collecting different measures and then information from participants and biomarkers and the dry blood spot. Wave 2, it was just generally a face-to-face encounter through telephone round, and similar to wave 3. But in wave 4, we're going to do the same the way how we did it in wave 1, like face-to-face encounters, and then collecting biomarkers, and then dry blood spot test for HIV, ART, and the level of blood sugar. And these below are levels of respondents in wave 1, like in wave 1, out of the targeted sample of 3,800, we were able to interview 3,013. In wave 2, we were able to interview 28, and then in wave 3, we were able to interview 2969, which is a very good retention rate compared to most of the studies which are involved in following people, like in a longitudinal study, especially that involves a cohort, because studies have reported that retention for such kind of studies is quite poor in some cases. So like in our case, retention rate is good so far since we started following people in wave 1, and currently is at 96%. That's from wave 1, 2, and 3. And as I've said earlier on, wave 3 is still under preparation, possibly might start data collection for 4 in the coming month or 2. So this just shows the geography of the place in Agincourt and the places where our participants, our sample possibly go and stay after they migrate from the study site. And if you can, as you can see here, there is a difference in terms of the number of people who migrated in wave 1. It is increasing here currently in wave 3. In wave 1, we only had 43% people who have moved from rural to urban. But in wave 3, the percentage has increased, and possibly it might continue increasing as time goes to wave 5. To the right here is just a map indicating where our participants normally stay after they migrate from Agincourt. And as you can see, some of the people, they migrate nearby the study site, but some, they move even far away, 500 kilometers away from the study site, to places in Gauteng, like Tembisa, Pretoria, even Rustenburg, and some they go to Witbank and then Secunda. Meaning, like, apart from short mobilities, we do have long-term mobilities or participants to as far as Gauteng and beyond. So these are some of the findings from our study. As you can see, most of the migrants, they do visit home after they migrate, and they do so regularly. And the pie chart here does indicate, for example, 44% of the respondents indicated that at least they had in here in the study site, at least on other holidays or irregular. And then we had 14% who indicated that they usually come over month ends, and about 12% at least 2 periods in holidays as well. And we've got 13% who said they always visit each month end, meaning like our participants, they do keep in touch to the original household. And we do have, of course, the others, about 50% after they migrate, they indicated like they did not even visit home. And of course, the percentage here is quite low, but most of them, they do keep in touch with their household of origin. Again, in terms of like remittance, I think it was touched on earlier on by Mike, but in a different point, but specifically to Agincourt and the migrant health follow-up study, we observed that 47% of our participants who have migrated from the study site, they do remit something back to the original household. And the remittances are selectively directed. For example, most of the migrants reported that they do send money back home to the mother. Of course, when you talk about remittance, in this case, not only money, but other kind of support. Others, 12% to their partners or spouse. Then 16% just indicated other member possibly in the household. And then you have a direct support to the child, and if fathers, like it was showing, they reported like only very few people, they do send support back to the household through to their fathers. Again, in terms of duration of our sample, after they have migrated, it shows that companion regression shows no variation by sex or matric, into education level, matric level, after adjusting for age. And you can see our one data set is showing like from 0 to 10, then 10 to 20, it's just like a graph from top here going down, picking up a little, but these variations do not show any kind of differences when measured and compared by sex and then educational level, especially matric level. Again, in terms of distribution of respondents by number of previous places where our participants have lived, we observed like males have more residential changes. As you can see from the tape here, it does show like those people who have migrated, zero not moved, possibly these non-migrants. Very few, I mean, most of them are females, but the number of males is lower. But as time goes in terms of mobility, one kind of mobility or one episode of mobility, there's some kind of change. Males possibly move, possibly not much compared to males, if you talk of one episode of migration. But as time goes, like for two mobilities or two episodes, males move more than compared to females. And this continues with time as well. More mobility patterns, 3+, it shows like males are moving more as compared to females.
Thanks, Satsan. Can you wrap up within 1 minute, please? Perhaps go on to the conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you. Then again, the likelihood of migration actually also is higher among it also goes with age, gender, male, then education, then the younger generation. Also here, it does show that when people migrate, preference is higher for those people compared to non-migrants. They use more of red meat, fast food, and then they do have sleep problems after they migrate. And again, it also shows that employment for females was higher as compared to their male counterparts. So as for conclusion, there's a substantial percentage of young adults becoming migrants, and there's a wide array of household members relation to household of origin, and head of origin, household head, sorry. And migrants increase over time. I think this has been shown in one of the presentations that was made yesterday. Also, after they migrate, they stay connected to their home community and household. Of course, a fraction of each, the relationship with the household is weak in terms of like household visits. They do visit rarely. Also, they eat more fast food, such as red meat in their diet compared to their non-migrants. they do have more street problems, and they've got we have more employment of females as compared to males. And again, there is selectivity in terms of remittance flow. So just to show you an idea about our research team, and this is the team, sure there will be some questions, some people will be able to assist me in the team who are attending this session today. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Satsan. That was excellent and a very interesting presentation. Thank you. We're going to be moving on to Professor Philippe Buckhere. I will ask the organizers, if possible, to share the PowerPoint, because I know Philippe's in France and in transit. So if we can have some assistance with his slide, that would be great. Philippe's going to be presenting on behalf of a paper that himself and Dr. Shira Menashe-Oren from the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium have been working on, and I believe it's published. And this is on the role of internal migration and urbanization. Thanks, Philippe.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep. And we're going to stick to 12 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Right. So I'm going to talk about the role of international migration in contemporary urban transitions, and using both indirect and direct methods to estimate this contribution of migration to urbanization. So here you have a slide showing the tremendous evolution of urbanization over the last 70 years or so. On the map and on the maps, and also on the graphs on the right, and you will notice that Africa has a lower urbanization rate than any other part of the world, but it's increasing steeply, and at the moment it's around 40%. Next slide. The urbanization dynamics are the interplay of several factors. First, there's the obvious effect of migration that is contributing to urbanization. That is mainly the balance between rural-urban migration and urban-rural migration. So the net migration to the benefit of urban areas. But there's also the so-called reclassification effect. That is when the administration decides on whether an area is considered urban or rural, and often it leads to a positive effect on urbanization. And there's also the difference in urban and rural natural growth, and that's a neglected part of the urbanization dynamics. And we'll see that it's actually an essential part of this dynamics. So the difference in natural growth means that simply that the urban areas are growing faster or slower than rural areas, depending on the context and the time. There is also the contribution of international migration, because most international migrants are settling in urban areas rather than in rural areas, to some exceptions. But we'll won't dwell too much on this matter today. Next. So what is the role of rural-urban migration and net migration on urbanization process? And a side question will be, is South Africa any different to that matter? Next. So we used two methods to estimate the contribution of migration, of net migration. First, we use indirect methods using actually a data set that is available through the UN. It's called Urban and Rural Populations by Sex and Age, URPAS. And it's available for the period from 1980 to 2015, so by step of 5 years, and it's available for almost 130 countries and least and developing countries, okay, less and least developed countries. It's built on census and population registers, and for some countries, the data are partly imputed based on sub-regional proportions of urban and rural, and that is for 38 countries. So part of the estimates are imputed. And we also have IPEM's international database, which collect a number of census data from 1970 to 2015, but it's only available for 32 countries across Africa and Asia. And for South Africa, it's available for the census from 2001, 7, and 11. Next. So using the indirect method, we use what we call the census survival ratio method to estimate net migration. And in the jargon, we call it seemingly unrelated regressions to estimate the contribution of natural growth and migration growth, and using as covariates the year, the country, the proportion urban, and the proportion urban squared. For the direct method, we use slightly more sophisticated models, and considering that we also have more data, we can also control for age, sex, and some biases. To control for some biases. I won't go into the details here. Next. So using the indirect estimation, we are pleased to inform you that actually what I'm presenting now is already published in PDR, and the title says it all. Urbanization is no longer driven by migration. Next slide. Next. So here we have on the left-hand side the estimated net urban migration rate between 85 and 2015, and I want you to concentrate on the curve in blue, and you can see that the net migration rate to the benefit of urban areas is declining from a little less than 1% to a little more than say 2 or 3%. The other estimates are for China, which has a very peculiar trend as compared to other countries, and also the purple curve is representing countries with imputed data, so less reliable data. For South Africa, you can see that on average, over the period, the same estimate was at a higher level, with a bump at the beginning of the curve showing a catch-up effect after the end of apartheid, and then a decline, but at a level that are still around 1%, which is much higher than the average country in the rest of the least and middle and least and middle income countries. Next slide. Now with our method, with some modeling, of course, here, we can see that the contribution of respectively the migration growth and natural growth. So natural growth is in orange, and migration growth is in blue. And you can see that as migration growth is declining and actually becoming negative in many parts of the world, the contribution of natural growth is increasing and almost always positive. And if you look at South and East Africa, we can see that its migration growth is declining, although it was positive longer than in other parts of the world. So the contribution of migration, the take-home message here from this slide is that the contribution of migration declines when the proportion urban is higher. Okay, next slide. And here is two graphs summarizing the trends. The graph on the left shows from 85 to 2015 that indeed natural growth was much higher, so around between 2 and 2.5%, contributing to urbanization, whereas migration was positive but declining quite importantly and becoming almost zero in 2015. And when we look on the right-hand side, we see that the contribution of migration is higher when the percentage urban is low, but it becomes negative after the percentage urban becomes higher than 50%, whereas the natural growth is always positive and actually increasing as the percentage urban is increasing. So the contribution, say at around 50% urban, is 0% due to migration and around 3% due to natural growth. I know I'm running out of time. Yes. So here is for South Africa an attempt to see what would be the situation for Africa in the future, and we see in the square, in the blue square, what it could become in the future. And so we are around at the moment, at this time, we are about 66% urban in South Africa, and the contribution of natural growth is much higher and positive, whereas migration growth would appear to be negative, actually. And the graph is slightly misleading in the sense that there is beyond a certain level of percentage urban, the graph is not really consistent with what it should be when urbanization stabilize at say around 70–75%, but it would mean that around 73% the migration would compensate negatively for a positive contribution of natural growth. Next slide. Next. Yes. So do we reach the same conclusion with direct estimation? Well, because for the sake of time, I will concentrate on the right-hand side graph, and you see that also the conclusion from the direct estimation is that the migration is declining steeply after 30% urban. Next slide. Next, yes, and for generally for all countries, the contribution of migration is declining, but using South Africa data, raw data from the census, it would appear to increase. But next slide, another, yes. yes, this one. There is a problem with the South African data, because the way the questions are asked in the census actually, next slide. Next slide, yes, underestimate the contribution of migration for under 5 and also return migration. So there is a problem with the way, I can't go into the details here, but there is a bias toward the most recent migrations, and also it doesn't capture return migrations. Okay, next slide. So to sum up, and this is the last slide, urbanization in low and middle income countries is now driven mostly by natural growth, contrary to the usual expectation. And but sometimes the indirect and direct estimates are difficult to reconcile, but so they are not showing exactly the same level of contribution, but this could be due to the different kind of data and also different countries that are covered by both estimates, but both show that the migration has a declining role, and to the benefit of natural growth. For South Africa, it's not so different in urbanization trends. There is higher urbanization than average, but there is also the problem of, the context, historical context that lead to a catch-up effect after apartheid, and also the problem with the data that is underestimating return migration. Okay, but we expect a higher contribution in the future of natural increase, and possibly a negative migration contribution. And my last comment is that my guess is that urbanization should or would stabilize at around 70 or 75% in South Africa. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for the speed.
Thanks so much, Philippe, for giving us of your time and presenting on such an interesting and relevant and important area. Thank you. I hope you can join us for questions at the end. This is just a reminder to all to please post your questions in the Slido platform. We will move on to Justin, Dr. Justin Bisaki, a senior research specialist at the HSRC, and his co-author, Professor Ivan Turok, will present their paper on the impact of rural to urban migration on household poverty, new evidence from South Africa. Justin, if you could proceed. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I trust I'm coming through and you can see my face, hear my voice, and see my slides.
Good.
Is that looking good? Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's great to be able to present our research to you today, which is focused on actually what happens to livelihoods when this internal migration takes place. We know that there is a lot of internal migration happening, but do people actually end up being better off? This is a really critical policy question. So in terms of the general context, South Africa during apartheid, put in place various forms of spatial policy that exacerbated and amplified these divides between different parts of the country, particularly between the former Bantustans and metropolitan areas. And the research shows that these have persisted even today. And whether you look at a variety of indicators such as education or income levels or access to basic services, you'll see that there's a stark spatial divide when looking at the South African population. One of the ways, and an important way in which this comes through, is in terms of the economy. And so we find that there is still today a mismatch between the spread of the population and the spread of jobs. The government's response so far has been primarily redistributive. So the fiscal system is progressive, and it skews public resources towards these rural communities and towns, mainly through the social grants and other free basic services. And this has been really important in helping the suffering of the poor, but it still raises the question of what are economic opportunities, and this is still a critical area for well-being. Now that COVID-19 has happened, researchers continues to show that certain places are far more susceptible to this crisis, and with the fiscal squeeze and social unrest, these spatial divides are critical for us to understand and critical for us to think about how to address in the development of South Africa. So people from rural areas, or one of the ways in which rectifying this mismatch between jobs and opportunities between rural and urban areas is migration, as people move to find a better life. But of course, there's no guarantee of success. The fragmented spatial structure of our cities means that people might move into a city but be kept on the peripheries, far away from where the opportunities really are, and towards the more core of the urban areas. These are crowded places, often having to stay in an informal settlement or in a backyard shack, actually far away from the jobs, opportunities and basic services that they might want to access. Our unemployment rate is still at a staggering level and continues to increase. And so there's intense competition for jobs in urban areas. And also we've heard from other speakers that in South Africa, people continue to maintain dual identities in terms of living in urban areas, but sometimes remitting income, also sometimes moving physically back or retiring back to their place of former residence in the future. So a key question that we try to answer is, do South African cities present more conducive environments for economic development and human progress than towns and rural areas? And following from this, does rural to urban migration offer people the prospect of a better future, whether moving actually enables access to employment and therefore an escape from poverty? Does it improve access to these basic services? Do people end up being able to live in a conducive environment? And so could rural to urban migration be a key mechanism for inclusive growth? So the data we use is the National Income Dynamics Study, which has 5 waves, and we create 3 cohorts. The first cohort is an urban-only cohort. So this is people who were in an urban area in all 5 waves, okay? We also look at a rural cohort, and this is people who were rural and remained rural in all 5 waves, and then the rural to urban migration cohort. So this is where someone was rural, and in a subsequent wave, they became urban and remained urban. Now, of course, within the migrant cohort, there's still the sort of circularity that could be taking place. Maybe we don't pick it up in the data. People could be remitting their income. And just to note, if you relax the assumptions around moving from a rural and to an urban area and perhaps back to a rural area, the results are pretty much the same. So just to note that. But so for our migrant cohort, these are people who were originally rural and end up becoming urban. We restrict the sample to the working age, but note that in by wave 5, people who were 15 years in wave 1 are now 23. So even though 15 years is quite young, over the duration of the panel, people are 23 years, 3 years. So let's look at some of the results, and the results really are quite striking and staggering when you look at them. So these are just basic descriptives, and to give you a help in understanding how it works, this blue line over here for the rural cohort, yeah, people are rural in every wave. This lighter blue for the urban cohort, people are urban in every wave. But for the migration cohort, in this first wave, 2008, everyone is rural. But by the time we reached 2017, everyone in the migration cohort would have been urban. Okay, so you would see this effect of moving from a rural to urban area in its sort of entirety only by the end of the period, which is in wave 5. And you can see here that there is this gap between the rate of unemployment, with unemployment in rural areas being much higher than in urban areas. And although there's a sort of general improvement for the NIDS cohort over time, you can see this gap remains in place, and it's a significant, statistically significant difference. And you can see for those who were rural but chose to migrate, by the time we reach this wave 5, when everyone has migrated, you can see that the unemployment rate is now adjusted to the same level as that for the urban cohort. It's still high, but it certainly is a significant improvement over what it would have been if these people had remained in the rural cohort. You might ask whether these jobs were, yes, people are migrating, but what's the quality of work? Well, this figure shows that a large proportion of work is precarious, whether it's casual or self-employed or people with a verbal contract. But importantly, what you can see is that for the migration cohort, it's at a similar level to those of the rest of the urban population. And that's about sort of a third of people in employment, which is of an informal nature. So 2/3 were actually in a job which we would categorize as formal, which is, so it's not just all informality taking place. What does this mean in terms of poverty, and this is specifically talking about the rate of income poverty? And you can see that because people are moving to urban areas from rural areas, and they seem to be moving into employment with better odds of getting a job, and some of these jobs are in the formal economy, which would pay a decent wage, you can see that what happens is that people end up being much better off in terms of their incomes. And you can see that this gap between urban and rural areas remains throughout the whole period, but people who were urban and then, who were rural and then moved to become urban by the end of the period, you can see that their poverty rate drops and then equalizes. This is not a statistically significant difference here. So it becomes, again, the same as the urban cohort. So all in all, what you see is that the migration jump has a big impact, and these numbers are really big. You can see the poverty level for those in the rural cohort is still at above 60%, whereas for the migrant cohort, it's hovering at around 30 to 35%. Having said all that, we do find that in terms of people moving into cities, that a large proportion of migrants do end up having to live in shacks. You can see that in terms of the urban cohort, it's normally around just under 20% of people who report living in a shack in all the waves. Whereas for the migrant cohort, it's very small in 2008 because everyone was in a rural area, and there's only a low level of living in shacks for rural dwellers. By the time everyone's moved into an urban area in 2017, you can see that as over 35% or between 35 and 40% are now living in a shack, whether a backyard shack or an informal settlement. So clearly people are needing to move to a city, but do have to compromise on the quality of their life in terms of trying to find a place to live. And this invariably does mean living in an informal settlement. Having said that, even though it's higher than for the rest of the urban population, it is still only roughly 1 in 3 migrants who are ending up living in a shack. 2 out of 3 would have been classified in a formal dwelling. So just
2 minutes, Justin. Thanks.
Just to say very quickly in my final 2 minutes is that important question is, are these impressive statistics happening because of explaining away because of other factors? And I'm not going to go into it for the purpose of this session, but just to say we have run sophisticated econometric modeling. And basically you find that the relationship is still large and significant, no matter what sort of models and controls we put on it. So this is strong evidence that this relationship could be of a causal nature. So just to comment, 2 out of 3 of the migrants who were in poverty in wave 1 had escaped from poverty from wave 5. So this is quite a remarkable sort of indicator of progress. And so it's important that we reflect on government's policy being fairly ambivalent about migration. We think that in light of the spatial mismatch, people should be supported in their spontaneous effort to move out of poverty by looking for a job in a city. And so there needs to be better coherence and coordination across local, provincial, and national government to support migration, not as just seen as something as putting pressure on the system in a negative light, but seen as a way of adjustment and seen of a way of potentially promoting a more inclusive country. And we asked the question, do any metros or cities even have a migration policy? And this is my last slide. So just to conclude, South African cities then need to become more inclusive spaces to support this evidence that we're seeing from the NIDS. This means a change of attitude from government towards migration and urbanization. It also means addressing the fragmented urban form. In other words, people are moving to cities, but it's important to think about where they end up moving into, and informal settlements are a key place for intervention. And also to say that a government would be, and cities would be far better off anticipating urbanization and preparing for it, not trying to react to it after the event, which becomes far more costly to address. And so we think that these results these results really should make us think more carefully about the role of South African cities and the role of rural to urban migration, to see it in a way in which we can support an inclusive form of development and an inclusive form of poverty reduction in our country. Thanks.
Thank you so much to Justin and Ivan, and very important to have these policy steps outlined and a very useful contribution. We will move to our next speaker, which is Emmanuel Mbuyiso, who is a senior research consultant at the Institute for Security Studies, and she'll be addressing us on a presentation entitled South Africa Must Prepare for Climate-Led Urbanization. Emmanuel, can you share your screen? Thank you.
Unmute. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. So my presentation will be slightly different from, oh, here we go. Sorry. My presentation is going to be slightly different from some of the ones that we've already seen. My expertise is in migration as opposed to urbanization. So I'm coming to this presentation with a slightly more thematic approach. So the most common narrative that we hear when we talk about climate migration is that it's going to drive a mass number of migrants from the global south to the global north. It's most often framed using words like waves and overwhelming, and we've seen estimates as high as 1 billion climate migrants by 2015. But the real truth is that climate change is and will drive far more migration within countries and regions, and that the bulk of this movement is going to be into cities. The most authoritative report that we've seen on the issue is the 2018 Groundswell report that was written by the World Bank, and it predicts 86 million climate migrants in sub-Saharan Africa by 2015. As we've already heard from Philippe, Africa is already the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. And with the climate impacts intensifying, this is going to both increase and change existing migration patterns. So Africa has the lowest emissions in the world. We make 3.7% of global emissions, yet it's one of the hardest hit continents by climate change. And that's by both sudden and slow onset impacts. So sudden onset climate impacts are large-scale singular events of extreme weather. The intensity and the frequency and the areas that are impacted by these are growing. And there are plenty of examples of this within the country and the region. So in the first half of 2021, all provinces in South Africa have experienced flooding. In 2019, the two biggest cyclones in history hit the coast of Southern Africa, mostly in Mozambique, and displaced 700,000 people. In sudden disasters, most people, which are easier to track because they're large-scale movements that happen suddenly, people most often move to the nearest and safest place or to where they can access aid. So this is local movement. Slow onset impacts are much harder to track because their impacts tend to be more broad and more complex. So between 1960 and 2021, South Africa has warmed at twice the global average. We've seen both hot and cold extremes have increased and decreased respectively. Rainfall seasonality has changed and the intensity of rainfall has increased. And heat waves are simultaneously more frequent and dry spells are longer. These all have major effects on crop yields, on livestock losses, on food security, and vector and waterborne diseases. And why this impacts continentally Africa more than some other places is that 95% of the food grown on the continent is rain-fed, and agriculture employs 65% of the labor force and contributes 32% of the continental GDP. So the trickle-down effects on the economic and social and health systems are really significant and they're overlapping. And this is why these movements are harder to track than sudden displacement. Studies that have been conducted in Delta regions that have been severely impacted by climate change, and those included the Volta Delta in Ghana, showed that 63% of the migrants cite economic factors as their key migration motivations, and only 3% cite environmental. And this is despite the fact that climate is the key factor that is deteriorating the economic situation. But even with that said, movement from the slow onset impacts is still local first and foremost, and it's often temporary, it's often circular. It usually involves like one family member or some members of a family that are trying to diversify income and send remittances, as we've already heard, apparently from SADS and mostly to our mothers, so that the rest of the family can stay in place. People most often move to areas where they already have existing ties, whether that's people or currencies or customs, and it's definitely usually cities. Something we often forget in the broader narrative is that international migration is expensive. So it requires funds, it requires networks, and it requires knowledge of how to get from one place to the other. And one aspect of climate migration that is way too often overlooked is immobility. So if you are a poor person suffering from diminishing returns from agriculture, then this is going to trap you in your poverty. So you're more prone to getting stuck, and this is something that's often overlooked. So are South African cities ready? So the extent to which climate migration and urbanization are disasters or a development opportunity, as we've already heard from Justin, depends really entirely on the responses. So it's been said many times in many different ways that climate change is a threat multiplier first and foremost. So that means it's going to exacerbate existing issues. So the most vulnerable countries and regions aren't necessarily the ones with the geographical vulnerabilities. It's areas that don't have the institutional capacity to respond. So an area that's heavily affected by environmental impacts that has strong governance and adaptation planning will suffer less at lower costs than areas that don't. So when we talk about climate change governance, we divide it generally into mitigation, which is reducing carbon emissions to slow or stop climate change, and adaptation, which is reducing the vulnerabilities to the negative effects. Most international attention and frameworks and leadership are focused on mitigation. And this is definitely urgent, especially for the wealthy countries who contribute the most emissions, but are also in better positions overall to adapt. But Africa as a whole, as I've already said, only contributes 3.7% of emissions. So we need to equally prioritize adaptation, even if international leadership does not. So South Africa is a pivotal country for climate change on the continent. It's the largest emitter on the continent and the 12th largest in the world. And that's because it's one of the most coal-dependent economies in the world. It is better equipped than most neighboring countries to address both the mitigation aspects and the adaptation. We have more access to innovation and technology and financing, and what we do is likely to be emulated by other countries. And individual assessments have shown that we actually have one of the most elaborate climate governance systems of all developing and emerging economies, as they say. But outside the frameworks, actual progress has been delayed and fractured, and coherence across the levels of government has actually been weak. So when we look at migration and urbanization within the climate change governments, we focus on adaptation because that's where it would fit in. Worryingly, but consistent with world trends, adaptation within South Africa lags mitigation, and it's even more under implemented. And furthermore, we've found that existing adaptation frameworks don't really account for the impacts that climate change is going to have on movement. So at the ISS, we conducted a study that analyzed existing climate change policies and frameworks, and we were looking for references and strategies that address this climate-linked migration, which is really going to be one of the faces. Climate migrants are going to be one of the faces of climate change. So there's currently no climate change legislation in South Africa. The 2018 climate change bill was released in June 2018, but has not yet been enacted. So that means that the approach so far has been policy, to focus on policy measures. And there are many different policies across multiple levels of governments and sectors and departments and commissions. And the Department of Environment, Forestry, and Fisheries is the focal point. Now, consistent with the international trends that I've spoken about, most of our national climate change policies are focused on the mitigation. There have been recent and promising shifts to include more adaptation work, and namely this comes with the adoption of the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy in 2020. So this was a big development. And the 2021 launching of the nationally determined contribution draft, which is what we deposit every 5 years with the UN framework. These are definitely promising developments. The strategy in particular is really comprehensive. So it maps out detailed impacts that we're going to need to adapt to and responses. So and they cover everything: agriculture, forestry, health, human settlements, disasters, infrastructure, mining, and more. It even goes as far to say that we need to be able to move businesses that are in climate vulnerable areas. But the only mention of migration or of changing population dynamics or rural to urban movement falls under the mention of possible areas of future research. So even these—
Sorry, we've got 2 minutes. Thank you.
So even these most advanced adaptation instruments don't actually address climate-linked movement. And this is really worrying in an already fragmented policy environment. Yeah, okay. And then just to conclude, I'll say it's clear that climate change impacts are intensifying across not only the country, but the region, which is important when we talk about migration. Excuse me. I think movement, it's fair to say that movement will not only increase, but that existing patterns will change, and that this needs our attention. So the diminishing returns in rural areas could drive more movement into cities. Sudden onset climate events could displace large numbers of people suddenly. And also cities that are more vulnerable to climate change impacts could see out-migration, which is another aspect that's often overlooked. In some cases, maybe even planned movement of vulnerable communities is something that we'd recommend. Excuse me. So I'll close just by saying that we urgently first need to pass the Climate Change Act and to legislate climate action. And I would probably boost on Justin's question where he says, do cities even have migration policies? And I would ask further, and if they do they include climate-linked factors? And I think I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. This is a really important aspect and really good to have this issue of climate change and migration and urbanization brought into the conversation. Our final input of speakers today are Dwakulu Tsishonga from the Department of Community Development at the University of KZN and co-author Zilungile Mabata, who are going to be talking to us about urbanization as a driving force behind rural to urban migration in South Africa. And I'll go over to you. Thank you so much. Perhaps we can share the presentation.
Karen, we're uploading the presentation.
Perfect, thank you.
Hi, Karen and the conference attendants, thank you very much for the opportunity given to us to present. I will be presenting on behalf of myself and Mbata on this topic of urbanization as a driving factor towards on urbanization. And again, once more, thank you, the organizers of the conference and you as the chair of this session. And again, to the previous presenters who have, in a way, tried to contextualize the issue of migration, but also rooting it within the context of rural-urban migration. And again, migration within the South African context is cannot be fully understood unless we understand the history of how this migration has been modeled using different policies. And some of these policies, the various speakers have talked about it. You are able to mention the Group Areas Act, and the last one, which has been repealed in 1999, it was the Alien Control Act. And again, all these policies were meant in order to make sure that there is a control of the movement of people based on race and also on ethnicity. Could I go to the other slide? As I indicated, is that we'll be presenting this paper in order to explore the driving, urbanization as a driving force behind rural-urban migration. And again, as other scholars have deliberated on international migration, rural migration is not as simple as that. I'm happy that the opening note or remark by Mark tried somehow to unpack some of these dynamics and issues underpinning this migration pattern. Okay, another slide.
Nkwankulu?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You also have control of your slides if you would like to proceed.
Oh, okay. As I indicated, is that in this paper, we want to submit that urbanization is more attached to the developmental modernization project, which saw the influx of rural people into the cities, and especially in the developing nations, and which means having based on the Western model of modernization, then which means it was more linked to the industrialization. And again, if recalling the scholar like Manuel Castell, he talked about the dependent urbanization, that it was more dependent on the industrialization. And that is very key in this paper. Hence, we argue that urbanization is more rooted in the industrialization project, which, I mean, the modernization scholar will talk about that. I mean, the vis-a-vis or the dichotomy between the traditional society and the modern society, industrialization becomes the outcome of that type of process. And that is very much important to understand the deprivation deriving from that. And today, this is the session which is so much, I mean, dedicated to understand not only to the higher level type of migration, but to say that as much as we are more worried about migrants coming into at the national level, let us look at the lower level. Let us look at this movement between the rural and the urban, but also let us look at the urban also moving to the rural areas at the same time. Hence, we are saying that this type of increase of population within the country itself, it is very much key. Various speakers have indicated, just in his last comment, he indicated that we mustn't envisage urbanization or migration in a negative way, but let us see that as an opportunity in order to plan, especially looking at the local government as well. But urbanization, in essence, it talks about the life of the people. It talks about humanity. The whole issue of migrating, as we are saying, that it is all centered around movement which has been happening time immemorial. We look at urbanization also in terms of the change of the size and the density, and also how the cities have been transformed. Cities are no longer the same as we would look at that. This movement of people through migration is very key, because we are talking about people moving, either forced or unforced, but we are also indicating that there are some consequences or the causes of that behind. Hence, we underpin the whole concept of internal migration in terms of where are the people moving from the rural and the urban areas as well. Okay, part of, Karen, I'm having some problem.
We can hear you.
I'm having some problem of moving the slide, yes.
Perhaps our IT team can assist.
Ngwakulu, which slide would you like to be on?
I'm on the slide on the conceptual kickstart, the one below rural urban.
Okay, we have that one. We can see conceptual kickstart.
Oh, yes, I can see that one. Again, I'm on the issue of trying to conceptualize in a more simplest way, indicating that migration on its own is a consequence of urbanization. My colleagues have already indicated. But this movement, which result into urbanization, has got some implication as well. Implication to who? Implication to the city government, their own governance, and also their planning. Most of our cities, they are very frustrated in terms of what you call these newcomers. Some of this frustration is more reflective of the apartheid spatial planning, which some scholars have indicated that much of what has been done today has more perpetuated the spatial planning, which categorized people in terms of their race and also in terms of their ethnic grouping. I mean, envisaging the city as the center, while the periphery is meant for certain grouping. And we talk about, it is important to restructure this spatial segregated, high fragmented, so that we are able to create a society which is not only inclusive, but which is able to cater developmentally of its own people. And after 27 of democracy, we still have that particular problem. Next slide, please. Then let us come to the issue of migration. Hence, today we're talking about that. As much as we talk about the cross-border, we talk about the international migration, there is an element here which is at home, which is more about internal. Internal, as various speakers have indicated, is that it is very difficult to measure. It is even very difficult to indicate who is migrating where and who is coming in and out. And that is very much important. But also to make sure that we empower the municipality, because municipality, they become the key actor in terms of managing migration through its planning. Hence, we again reiterate that migration, urbanization has got a way in terms of increasing the rural urban migration. The other slide, please. The other slides. Thank you very much. Then, which means we are talking about that urbanization across. Then it contributes, or its significance in a more proportional. Either in Africa, if you look, for example, in Africa, when we look at Johannesburg, we're able to look at the 4.4 million people, and we're able to look at other cities as well in Africa. We are looking at the very massive, rapid urbanization, the migration of the people. Then the question is that how do we manage the whole process without, going back to some of the discriminatory policies? How do we take this process as an opportunity in order to plan or to have inclusive cities? Another slide, please.
Thanks, Ndwakulu. Can we wrap up in 2 minutes, please? Thank you.
And that means we are able to see the trend of rural-urban migration. But part of this configuration, then we're also able to see rural dwellers also, rather than looking at the rural-urban migration, we're able also to look at the urban-rural migration, where some people consciously, they are taking a decision also to go back to the rural areas. We have seen within the cities, for example, the city of eThekwini, we look at the south coast, the Adams, for those who know the place, we're able to see, especially the skill or the professional, having to build the houses at the outer skirts, and which means we are able to have a linear way of understanding rural-urban migration, because it is taking a different turn. But what is the solution to this? Then which means if we want to either to block or to regulate or to balance, then which means we need to be in a position to educate. Educating who? The city governments and also the municipalities in the rural areas. Also giving the opportunities, so that we are able to create employment, rather than to be at the controlling element of migration. And again, some of the solution which can be looked, I'm having problems, which can be looked at, as I indicated, is that, are the cities inclusive of gender? Is there enough investment? Otherwise, we wouldn't have a problem which the rural areas are not even more attractive. Do we have agricultural systems which are more modernized? Do we have the financial system which are more innovative? Some of these proposals, they could be in a way not only to keep those who were born in the rural areas, but to give them opportunity so that people, they can be in a position to move as freely but they mustn't move from the materialist point of view. I'd like to thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Ndwakulu, and it looks like we really need a lot more time dedicated to these conversations. We've come to the end of our set of speakers, and thank you to you all for your very vital and insightful inputs. We have a short input from Dr. Ndu Biasi, who's a senior lecturer at the School of Economics at the University of Johannesburg. And in the interests of very little time left and the number of questions we've received, I'd like to ask Ndu if you wouldn't mind limiting your input to 7 minutes, please. And over to you to take us through some thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen. Well, I'll be very brief. I'll hide my video because of poor internet connection, if that's okay with you. So basically, I mean, I actually I've been wrestling with some of the ideas, you know, and listening to as many presentations as I can, you know, and taking notes at the same time because. You know, I received very few papers, you know, to read for this. So what I'll do is basically just read from my notes in terms of this. So the 2 sessions dealt with data and methods for studying migration and internal migration and urbanization. And so the common thread, it appears to me, through all the presentation was the issue of migration. In particular, that internal migration, including child migration, has been persistent, particularly among African households in the countryside. We also learned that although internal migration has been persistent, it has not happened in a smooth fashion. It has been interrupted by negative shocks, thus affecting living arrangements and mobility. And most presenters, particularly in the second session, appear to take the view that although the South African government is generally concerned, or at least have some fears about large-scale internal migration because of the burden placed on public services, there is evidence to suggest that migration is associated with reduction in poverty, unemployment, and upward mobility. Now, I mentioned in passing that South African government appeared to have fears about large-scale migration because of the burden placed on public services. But when I looked at one of the papers by Cross and Dinda, what I learned is that maybe the things that our government was most afraid of has actually happened. In their paper, Cross and Dinda cite the demographic economist J.K. Galbraith, 2012, who argues that, at least using the EU data, that migration itself is a direct cause of unemployment, as large number of migrants from less advantaged regions flock to high-wage destinations, thus overwhelming destinations' absorptive capacity with an overflow of work seekers relative to available jobs. Cross and Dinda therefore concludes that the large-scale migration from South Africa's rural sector and the Southern African region to South Africa's mines fits with this model. It highlights, according to them, the factor of labor migration in driving permanent urbanization at destination points as labor migrants abandon secular migration, stabilize, and settle permanently. And so what we learn from their study is that migration itself is a direct cause of unemployment, which I think is quite interesting. And that labor migrants abandon secular migration, stabilize, and settle permanently. Of course, it would be interesting to see the numbers in terms of this. This therefore raises a lot of interesting questions. Should South African government, make cities more inclusive? I think the paper by Bisaki and Associates, alludes to this particular point. And more productive rather than reactionary responds to controlling and restricting the movement of people, which can have unintended consequences. The second question, which is also quite important, is should migrants be included in local programs of social protection and even targeted for support. The third question is whether the government should upgrade dense informal settlements as common entry points of migrants looking for access into cities. These questions relate directly to the study done by Bisaki and his associate. The other question to keep in mind is perhaps the extent to which increase in urban population caused by higher rates of natural increase in towns and reclassifications of settlements into urban areas. I was quite excited to learn about the innovative migration data sources presented by Rango, and needless to say that any data on particularly internal migration is important, for urban planning, delivery of public services, and infrastructure development. I particularly like the mobile phone data idea because it is a promising avenue for complementing traditional national migration stats, and because it is obtained timely and because it is obtained timely and in terms of local data. And there's a great potential, to advance research on migration. I think by and large, those were my comments. The one thing that I felt maybe was not touched on here were the cost on the households, which help to explain, why more households do not send temporary migrants. These includes financial cost, but the main two areas of concerns are health and social connections. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mdu, for summarizing, for these insightful points, and for leaving us with a set of questions to consider in terms of a way forward. Now, we've had quite an interest in this session and a number of questions, and I'll go through them all and then turn to the individual speakers to respond. Just going to the slider. So we had 3 questions for Mark. The first is, what is the method of sending these remittances? Couldn't these remittances sometimes be in a form of household items? That was from Musi. We had a question for Mark as well. Do we know where people are migrating to when they leave their rural towns? Does the data show their exact locations? That was from Celeste. And then the third one to Mark, are the calculations of out-migration rates excluding return migration or multiple or repeated migrations? What is the denominator or population of reference used in the calculations? Okay, so I will just go through all the questions and then turn to each person to respond to their set of questions. We've got a number directed to Philippe. The first was from Ivan, very confusing how the model suggests net out migration from urban to rural areas in South Africa. Another to Philippe, how is it possible that the contribution of internal migration is declining, while at the time we observe a sustained population growth and overall fertility indicators suggest a decline in the number of children per woman in Africa, especially in South Africa? There was a comment, how do you control population growth except using birth control? And then from Lessing to Philippe, is the natural growth urbanization linkage explained by urbanization of poverty growth of slums with worse health and reproductive indicators than rural areas? So those were all to Philippe. Turning to Justin, Blessing has a question for the poverty rates between rural and urban areas. Sorry, are the poverty rates between rural and urban areas remaining constant? What is the explanation? Is it that nothing changed for rural South Africa over time? And then a final one to Emmanuel. In the SA context, is there a coordinated approach currently undertaken by government and private sector to address issues of climate change? So I'd like to ask each speaker to respond, just bearing in mind that we have very little time. So if you can take the set of questions and respond to them in about 2 minutes each. And then that's over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Good questions all. Vusi, the method of sending the remittances, this is most often done now through shopping chains like ShopRite, vouchers that can be sent by a phone and then redeemed at something like ShopRite. Post office used to play this role, but and all of this is in the absence of banks penetrating deeply into rural areas, although they get as far as small towns. And as you ask, remittances are often brought home in the form of household items. Something like a fridge is something that people, successful migrants love sending back a fridge, because that's a good support for the house. Celeste, where do people go? Interestingly, we don't have such a good sense of place the way that we talk about where we are. So it's not a very straightforward thing. We make a special effort. The study that you've seen Karen Ginsberg and Satsan Harawa presenting, Migrant Health Follow-Up Study, we specially designed that coming out of the HDSS so that we could get much tighter, more accurate measures of where people are. In HDSS, if it's a non-resident household member, in other words, a de jure member of our population. Gabriel, about the computations, thank you, about out-migration rates. The denominator is the population at risk, and that's quite precisely measured in the HDSS. And as we constrain the numerators, so we constrain the denominator, for example, by age or by period. And then in the HDSS, we have sufficient detail of temporal data to track migrations as events. So the migration rates I was showing you is the event of a migration occurring over the population at risk. And return migrations are in there, can be discriminated, which we do in some papers called Madima papers. And repeat migration is no problem. If somebody left and came back, well, then they would be returned. But repeat migration, we do track those as events as much as we can. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. That's great. Can we move to Philippe to answer some of the selected questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
All right, okay, good. So the first questions were about whether how can migration contribution be decline or be negative? Okay. So these conclusions about the growing role of natural growth is not new, actually. This is something that we confirmed from previous studies. So it's not actually our specific contribution. Our specific contribution was that we did it for many countries. And we noticed that it's actually the same for all these countries and not just for some countries only. Okay. What happens is that the migration, the rural urban migration, is still there. It doesn't mean that it's no longer there, and there are a number of papers and number of studies that show that there is a constant flow of rural to urban migration. What it means is that there is also urban to rural migration, and some of papers that I've listened to were also talking about these return or so-called return migration, which are not always return in the sense that it's not necessarily migrants that went first to urban and then returned to rural. It can also be children who are actually moving out of urban areas and to rural areas. And the reason why it happens is that the reason why natural growth is contributing significantly to urban growth is that despite lower fertility, is to do with the structure of the population. The structure of the population is concentrated mainly around working age population, which happens to also be reproduction age. So it means that there are not so many elderlies, and children are and the mortality is fairly low in urban areas as compared to rural areas, and the structure of the population makes the urban areas grow. Okay, and that's what is making the higher contribution of natural growth as compared to migration growth. I hope it answers the questions. I don't remember the last question, Karen, because I have difficulty to access the conversation. What was
sure,
the last
I think this
question?
is blessing. Is the natural growth
Yeah.
urbanization linkage? I think you've addressed that.
Okay. Or maybe the last but one.
Growth of slums with worse health and reproductive indicators than rural area.
Sorry, repeat.
Is the natural growth urbanization linkage explained by urbanization of poverty, growth of slums with worse health and reproductive indicators than rural areas?
Oh, that's a complicated question.
Well,
I mean,
a very response given the time we have left.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so sorry, I can't really answer the question.
Okay, thank you, Philippe.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
thank
thanks.
you to all for the questions and engagements on this. Really important questions that we can consider going forward. Moving to Justin, there's another question, Justin, that came up. How do you explain your results in relation to the assertion by some scholars that SA is also experiencing urban to rural migration? And if you can just respond to the two questions, keeping to about 2 minutes if possible.
Sure, I'll try and be brief. Thanks, Karen. So to start with that one on moving from an urban area back to a rural area, the sample size for the NIDS is, that kind of movement is a bit small for us to analyze explicitly. But I think it's important to realize that even for our rural to urban sample, there are a whole lot of connections and dual identities that are happening even if people are physically moved to an urban area and remain there, whether it's through remittances or through maintaining their membership of a household in another area. So I think it's important not just to think about it as people are now urban, that even though we're looking at a rural to urban cohort who have moved physically, of course, there is still this sort of circular makeup. And it's important for us to maybe research that in more detail to sort of understand, could it be problematic in splitting up families, or in what ways can we support it so that it's conducive to development. The second question was around the poverty in particular, and if I can just show you that slide because I think this is important. So you can see that between rural and urban areas, there is a really big gap in the rate of poverty, and overall it's not actually declining. Okay, and there's also research by, I think it's Michael Noble, who shows from detailed census data that the most deprived areas in SA, even if they're getting better off over time, the relative level of deprivation is still remaining the same. In other words, the spatial inequality in our country is entrenched and it's not necessarily improving. But just to note that if poverty levels were as high as 80% at the start of the period, for our migrant cohort, they're now as low as 30%. So that's a 50 percentage point reduction. So, you know, the main message here is that even though there are these stark spatial inequalities, certainly between 2008 and 2017, the data suggests you can get a big improvement. That's not to say that this will not necessarily happen in the next period. There's every reason that people will migrate to a city and still find life very difficult. But I think the policy message is that we need to be more progressive and have a better attitude towards supporting people moving to cities rather than trying to keep them where they are in rural areas which are lagging behind. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Justin. We are running against time with 30 seconds on the clock. But I'd like to give Emmanuel a chance to very briefly respond before we close. Thank you. Emmanuel, are you with us still?
Shoot, sorry, my bad. I had my
We've got very little time, but there was a question on.
I got the question on
okay,
whether or not. Yeah, so
response.
it's on whether or not there's a concerted effort with the private sector. And yeah, there's currently, so as of December, there's a presidential climate commission, and it involves quite a few commissioners who are from the private sector. And they did release their first report, so their first set of recommendations this month. But again, as I said in my presentation, it's really quite focused on mitigation. So a lot of it is focused on reducing carbon, green transport, and phasing out carbon, introducing more renewable energies. Very little in there that I've seen about adaptation. And then the one other question I was just going to answer quickly was about the remittances. So someone asked, if it was things, it's also skills. And I think that really is an important point, and it factors into climate migration. So people are bringing home new skills that are helping them out in agricultural areas, and they're sending money and stuff that's helping with climate resilience. So people are, you know, contributing for irrigation or climate or drought resistant seed back in the homestead. So they're using migration and remittances to do that, which is an important resilience factor and allows people to stay in place. And I'm done.
And I'd just like to thank everybody, to the speakers, to our discussants, for the absolutely engaging presentations and inputs, and for the great questions and engagement. And I think we really at a place where, with the launch of the Migration Forum tomorrow, we can really see a way forward with these very rich data sources that we have on hand and the skills amongst us all as a team. So I'd like to close this session and hand over to Diego, and thank everybody and the organizers very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you to everyone in this session. I found this to be really useful and very educating. I think that there are many opportunities and challenges in this particular space that we can take advantage of. Before I close for today, just a reminder that tomorrow we'll start at 9 o'clock. We're looking at policy issues here. We'll be joined by the Deputy Director General in the Presidency, and if I'm not mistaken, he's also the Principal of the School of Government, Mr. Busani Nyaweni. He will be leading us tomorrow in a panel discussion, which will include the MEC for Basic Education in Gauteng, Mr. Panyaza Lesufi. After that, we will have a general session that will have 4 presentations looking at various policy issues related to migration governance as a means of going forward. There'll be a short break at around midday, and at 12:15 we will then be joined by the Statistician General, as well as the Acting Director General of the Department of Social Development, to launch the Migration and Urbanization Forum. Then just 2 announcements that I'd like to make. Firstly, I have placed the link for the IOM GymDAC African Union webinar starting at 2 o'clock. So that's in about an hour in the chat box. And I can also confirm that all the presentations are under the conference program link on the conference website. So that will be all the presentations for day 1 to 4. Of course, as we finalize tomorrow, during the final session tomorrow, we will then put up the link for day 5. So we will keep that website live, and you can use that website as a means of accessing that information. With that said, let me thank everyone for your attendance and participation today. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for the final day of this first National Migration and Urbanization Conference. Great afternoon. Bye.
To all social service professionals, you have been working throughout the national state of disaster and more, taking care of us and our communities, caring for our children, and assisting children in need of protection and care, caring for the elderly and the most vulnerable, helping to pick up the pieces when South Africans and families are in distress. You have been there for us, standing firm on the front line in the face of this pandemic. And now it's time for the country to care for you, to help keep you and your loved ones safe through vaccination. If you work in the social service sector and are registered with the South African Council for Social Service Professions, you will be preloaded onto the EVDS system. To be vaccinated, you will need to bring your SA identity document or passport, your employee card and practice card, or a receipt for registered practitioners, a confirmation letter on letterhead from your ECD center for ECD practitioners, medical aid cards for those on medical aid, a cell phone number to receive SMSs. Please speak to your program manager about where and when your vaccination is scheduled. To check that you are included in the DSD cluster vaccination program, use these contacts.